Do you not understand what we're saying? You really are dim-witted, said my in-laws as they tried to kick me out. I told you time and again not to leech money from our son. Disappear, you parasitic wife. Despite their harsh words, I decided to leave. Arguing seemed pointless. It might be enlightening for you to personally experience who the real parasite is, I murmured to myself. My name is M. I'm a 35-year-old office worker. Tom and I have been married for 3 years. We don't have children yet, but with both of us having incomes, we used to enjoy trips and dining out, cherishing our happy days together. Now that I've transitioned to remote work, I handle household chores, allowing Tom to focus solely on his job. On weekends, he helps around the house, and we've managed to maintain a balanced married life. Tom and I met at a group blind date, and I was drawn to his kind smile instantly. After dating for 2 years, we got married. Even after marriage, Tom has always been incredibly supportive, his smile healing me every day. However, our happy marriage isn't without its challenges, mainly the presence of my in-laws. Tom's family runs a ramen shop that his father started 15 years ago after leaving his office job. The business seems successful with several branches in the city. The first time I met my in-laws, they were dressed in expensive luxury brands, seemingly more for show than genuine choice. To put it bluntly, they seemed nouveau rich. Our first meeting was when we visited them to announce our marriage, and from the start, they seemed to look down on me. Any daughter-in-law is fine as long as she can do housework and doesn't cause trouble, but she does seem to lack fortune, doesn't she? They remarked. I was taken aback by their directness. My husband quickly reprimanded them, and they behaved better afterward. Yet I realized there were people who spoke their minds without a filter. Perhaps it's a trait of restaurant owners, especially ramen shop owners, to be assertive. Thankfully, my husband is always on my side, reassuring me that even if I were to lose my job, we would manage together. Is this version okay, or would you like further adjustments? I wouldn't consider working in a ramen shop, so their words didn't bother me much. Besides, my husband apologized many times for his parents' rude behavior and assured me that we only needed to interact with them during major family events. Apparently, he doesn't get along well with them. I heard that his father had always been stubborn and struggled as a salaried worker. Though kind to my husband, his attitude became arrogant and condescending after his ramen shop became popular. He often meddled in my husband's career choices and demanded more respect because he was the breadwinner. That's why my husband didn't like being around his parents and moved out when he went to college. The only thing he's grateful to his parents for is that the profit from the ramen shop funded his college education. Thanks to that, he got a job in a reputable company and wants to repay them for their kindness someday. But other than that, he generally wants to avoid them. Since he told me that I hadn't met with my in-laws even once after getting married, I think one reason we haven't had to meet them is that we don't have children yet. For a while, we lived happily as a married couple. However, recently my in-laws' ramen shop started facing financial difficulties. Their rude attitude was the main cause. In the past, if a ramen shop had good food, people would visit even if the owner was gruff and unapproachable. But now, online reviews and social media heavily influence a shop's reputation. The in-laws service became the subject of many negative reviews. Complaints ranged from the owner being too curt to messy serving by the waitresses, to the owner visibly getting grumpier during rush hours. It felt like they had become complacent due to their initial success. However, in reality, their business dwindled, and the branches served food worse than instant ramen. Negative reviews spread rapidly, causing their shop's reputation to plummet. They blamed the times and stubbornly stuck to their old ways, which eventually led to the closure of all their shops, including the main one. It seems they finally realized the gravity of the situation. Uncharacteristically, they turned to their son, my husband, for help. "Tom, please help us. At this rate, we'll end up on the streets," they pleaded. My husband had anticipated his parents would come to us like this. It really didn't work out, did it? I told you before, didn't I? If you act too arrogantly, you'll end up regretting it. There's a saying that the customer is God. If you treat them carelessly, they'll come back to bite you. Back then, you dismissed my words as just naive opinions, didn't you? This is your own doing. You really should reflect on your actions. I'm sorry. Would you like any further adjustments? But turning to us for help is futile. My husband stated firmly. My in-laws collapsed to their knees, crying at his harsh words. I never imagined my kind-hearted husband could be so stern. Yet I could feel the love he held for his parents in his words. He spoke sternly out of concern for them. At that moment, I realized how admirable my husband's character was and fell for him all over again. Eventually, my in-laws gave up and left. However, a month later, they returned to us looking completely worn out without a single branded item they used to flaunt. Even after selling all our branded goods, we still can't pay off our debt. We even sold the car, but there's still so much debt remaining. Can you help us out, please, Tom? We don't have anyone else to turn to, they pleaded, bowing deeply to their son. My husband crossed his arms, pondering what to do. I wasn't fond of my in-laws, but seeing them in such dire straits made me want to help them. Tom, what about sending them a monthly allowance? I suggested. My husband looked surprised, and the in-laws also looked shocked, lifting their heads to gaze at us. Emily, are you sure? My husband asked. Yes, I replied. You mentioned wanting to repay them for putting you through college, didn't you, Tom? Is that true? Well, I didn't say something like that. My husband hesitated. Tom, please, we'll work hard to pay off our debts. Can you at least support our living expenses? The in-laws pleaded again, bowing deeply. In the end, my husband agreed to support his parents. He decided to transfer $700 to them every month. Would you like any adjustments to this version? I chose to send $800 every month. My husband told me I didn't need to send that much, but I wanted my in-laws to pay off their debts and restart their lives as soon as possible. I believe this incident would make them reconsider their arrogant attitude. Besides, I had a source of income other than my regular job, income from real estate. I had been studying stocks and investments for a long time and had managed to grow my assets through it. After accumulating a decent amount of wealth, I purchased a luxury apartment and used it for rental income. Little by little, my assets grew, and I bought another apartment for real estate investment. Before I knew it, I was earning around $700,000 annually, so I had a lot of financial leeway. Of course, I kept this a secret from my in-laws. I was giving my husband a bit more money than necessary to support his parents for his sake. The in-laws were very grateful for our support and expressed their thanks. Tom, thank you so much. Thanks to you, our life is slowly becoming stable, they said. Seeing them express their gratitude made Tom visibly happy. I hoped that with this, they would find jobs and be able to repay their debts. However, a month went by, and it seemed they still hadn't found any work. An even more troubling issue arose. The in-laws started visiting our house frequently during weekdays. Our food expenses are getting a bit much, Emily. Could you possibly give us something to eat? They would say. They started coming around lunchtime and asking me for food. Initially, they'd just eat and leave, but recently they'd been lounging on the sofa after meals and even asking for desserts. Is this version alright, or would you like further adjustments? I have work too, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't stay too long, I told the in-laws as my work was beginning to be affected. The in-laws exchanged glances and laughed. Work? Aren't you always at home? If you're going to lie, at least make it more believable, they scoffed, chuckling. Perhaps because they've been in the food and beverage industry for a long time, they might not be familiar with the concept of remote work. I tried explaining it in detail to them, but they responded with, "We don't really understand all this computer stuff," and didn't try to comprehend my explanation. No matter how much I told them I was busy with work, they wouldn't listen, and their demands only increased. Emily, we're out of tea. Hurry up and go buy some. Don't you have any snacks? Prepare some rice crackers or something. Such a useless daughter-in-law. For a housewife, you're really inconsiderate, they criticized. The in-laws kept blaming me with such words. They promised to work and repay their debts, but they kept saying they couldn't find jobs and continued to intrude into our home during the day. Moreover, they hurriedly leave before my husband returned. Probably they felt a bit guilty towards him, who was providing them financial support, or maybe they just didn't want to be asked if they found a job yet. Is this version okay, or would you like any further adjustments? I was at my limit, even though I contribute a significant part of the money we give them. Why do I have to be treated this way? I stood up to the in-laws and said firmly, "Please leave now." The in-laws, seemingly never expecting me to say that, were taken aback for a moment, but immediately their faces turned bright red with anger. "Who do you think you are? A mere wife giving orders to your husband's parents?" they retorted. "Exactly, and you're just a housewife depending on Tom's income. How many times do I have to tell you I'm not just a housewife? Enough of your delusional stories. That's how the in-laws kept shouting. Then, with a gleam in their eyes, they came up with an idea. Right, you should just leave this place. What? I exclaimed. Indeed, that's the best idea. It's because of you that Tom's remittance to us is so small. You know we're sending you $1,500 a month, right? What do you mean it's not enough? I asked incredulously. Well, that's just what our living expenses amount to normally. It's actually barely enough, they insisted. I was at a loss for words. They seemed to be the type who, no matter how much money they received, couldn't give up their luxurious lifestyle. As I stood there in disbelief, they glared at me coldly. Hey, how long are you planning to stand there daydreaming? Pack your bags already, huh? Don't you understand what we're telling you? You really are dense, aren't you? We're telling you to stop leeching off our son for money. Get lost, you parasite of a wife. They sneered. With those words, the in-laws tried to throw me out. I realized there was no point in talking to them anymore, so I decided to leave as they demanded. Understood. I'll pack my things and leave, I said calmly. My in-laws looked smug. Now our lives are finally secure, they chuckled. If it was just the three of us, Tom and us, everything would have gone smoothly from the start, I thought to myself, ignoring their hurtful remarks. Is this version okay, or would you like any further adjustments? I began to pack my things. I'll disappear as quickly as possible, I thought. Hearing this, my in-laws left with a look of satisfaction. That night, I explained the situation to my husband. When he returned home, he was more dumbfounded than angry. Emily, I'm truly sorry, he said. It's okay. Now I realize that they'll never change. It's good to know that there's no point in trying anymore. I comforted my husband. Together, we packed our things and decided to leave the house. About 2 weeks later, we received a call from the in-laws. So, what's the situation now? Have you left the house? I've been trying to contact Tom about the remittances, but he seems too busy to answer the phone. We've already left, so you can rest easy. You won't see me in front of you anymore, I replied. Hearing this, I could hear my in-laws rejoicing on the other end. Ah, I see, haha. Finally, our son can get rid of the burden that was you. Haha, now with this, Tom's remittances will increase and our life will get easier, they chuckled. The in-laws seemed pleased as they continued their conversation. I sighed and responded sharply. You really had a lot to say about me, didn't you? It would be good for you to experience firsthand who truly fits the description of a parasite. As I said this, I could hear the in-laws getting angry again. With that attitude, you truly are a hopeless daughter-in-law. Well, you're probably not even our daughter-in-law anymore. You might as well live a poor and lonely life, they snapped. My in-laws were so deluded, I figured I'd just let them keep believing that. So I made some non-committal responses and hung up the phone. Is this version alright, or would you like any further adjustments? I received another call. Do you need something else? As soon as I answered, my in-laws, sounding panicked, started interrogating me. What the hell is going on? When I went to the apartment where Tom lives, someone else was living there. You know something, don't you? Even if you two broke up, tell me where Tom is, they demanded information. My husband, who was listening next to me, took the phone. I've always been with Emily, Tom. Why are you with that woman, and why have the remittances to us stopped? Maybe because you insulted and tried to drive away my precious wife. I won't forgive anyone who hurts my beloved wife, even if it's my own parents. Besides, you never listened when Emily explained multiple times about her job and such. Did you? You probably didn't even try to find out that Emily was sending you more money than I was. Is that true, Emily? Were you sending them $1,500 every month because you wanted them to pay off their debts quickly? And yet, they insulted you, calling you useless. I won't be sending anything to such parents, sorry, but I'm cutting ties with you as family. Now, deal with your debts on your own, my husband declared firmly. Wait, I had no idea Emily was earning so much. Can you forgive us if we apologize? Maybe then you can send money again, pleaded my in-laws. It's too late, just give it up, my husband replied, hanging up the phone. I then blocked my in-laws' number, ensuring that we would no longer be involved with them. According to what my husband heard from relatives, our in-laws sold their house but couldn't pay off their debts. Now, they apparently live in a rundown apartment, both working low-wage jobs to make ends meet and pay off their debts. When they were successful with their ramen restaurant, they reportedly acted arrogantly towards their relatives. When they ran out of money, they seemed to have asked their relatives for help, but nobody assisted them. So, they are now completely isolated, living in absolute poverty. My husband and I have given them as much support as we could. We can't cover for them anymore. It's their own doing. I doubt they'll ever change their ways or attitude, so they might as well continue living this way. On the other hand, we continue to enjoy our time together as a working couple. A year later, I became pregnant. I hadn't expected to have a child at this time, but we are grateful for this blessing from above. Together with my beloved husband, we plan to raise our precious child. Does this version meet your expectations, or would you like any further adjustments?
Rebecca slammed the door shut behind her, eyes blazing with fury. I've had enough, Ben. If you don't cut her out of our lives, I will. Ben looked up from his phone, startled. Amy, my sister? What the hell happened now, Rebecca? She's trying to ruin us. Rebecca snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. What are you talking about? Ben asked, putting down his phone and standing up. Tonight was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. It was just for us, Rebecca said. But Amy had to show up uninvited and create a scene. Ben sighed. What did she do this time? Rebecca crossed her arms, anger and frustration clear on her face. She made a spectacle, drunk and obnoxious. She picked a fight with the waiter, embarrassed us in front of all those people. She's going through a lot, Rebecca, Ben said, his tone defensive. She's not herself lately. That's your excuse every time. Rebecca's voice was rising. You always take her side, Ben. She's family, Rebecca. She needs me. Rebecca shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. This isn't the first time she's pulled something like this. Remember our wedding? Ben's face tightened at the mention of their wedding. That was different, he mumbled, knowing full well it wasn't. Different? Rebecca echoed. She tried to hijack it, Ben. She made that day all about her. Ben opened his mouth to speak, but didn't have the words. He knew Rebecca was right. Amy had always been a tornado, drawing attention and creating chaos wherever she went. You never see it, Rebecca continued, softer now. You never see what she's doing to us, to you. Rebecca, Ben began, but she cut him off. No, listen to me. Rebecca's voice was low but firm. Every time she disrupts our lives, you excuse it. You say she needs help, that she's family, that things will change, but they never do. Ben rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his sister's actions pressing on him. What do you want me to do, Rebecca? She's my sister. I want you to set boundaries, Ben, Rebecca said, her tone pleading. I want you to put us first for once. Ben looked into his wife's eyes, seeing the hurt and exhaustion there. He knew Rebecca was right. Amy was a problem he'd been avoiding for too long. I'll talk to her, Ben said finally. I'll make sure she knows she can't keep doing this. Rebecca nodded but didn't seem convinced. It's not just about talking, Ben. You need to be firm. I will, Ben promised, though even he wasn't sure he believed it. I just need time to figure it out. Rebecca shook her head, turning away. Time's running out, Ben. The room fell silent, the weight of their confrontation hanging in the air like a storm cloud. As Ben watched Rebecca walk away, he couldn't help but feel the intensifying rift between them, a rift that his sister had helped carve deeper and deeper over the years. The morning sun streamed through the bedroom window as I woke up, feeling the tension from last night still hanging in the air. Ben was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I knew I had to address the issue before it consumed our weekend. Amy called, Ben said as I entered the kitchen, his tone already defensive. Of course she did. What does she want now? I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. She says she's lonely and asked if she could stay over this weekend, Ben said, avoiding my eyes. I could feel the anger rising in me. Ben, we've been planning this romantic getaway for weeks. We need this time alone. I know, but she sounded really upset. Maybe just this once? Ben pleaded. It's never just once with her, I snapped. She's always here, imposing on our lives. We barely get any time to ourselves. Ben sighed. I'll talk to her. Maybe she won't stay the whole weekend. She shouldn't be here at all, I said, my voice firm. We deserve this time together, Ben. You promised. Before Ben could respond, there was a knock at the door. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as he opened it to reveal Amy standing there, a suitcase in hand. Surprise! Amy said, a forced smile on her face. I figured you'd say yes, so I came over early. I shot Ben a look, and he grimaced. Amy, we talked about this. You can't just show up uninvited. Oh, come on, Ben. It's just one weekend. Amy said, brushing past him into the living room. It's never just one weekend, Amy, I said, trying to keep my cool. We've had this planned for a long time. I know, and I'm sorry, but I really need this. I'm so lonely and bored, Amy whined. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. You knew we had plans. This isn't fair to us. Amy rolled her eyes. You're always so dramatic, Rebecca. It's just a few days. I won't be a burden. You are a burden, Amy, I said, my patience wearing thin. We need our space. Ben, do you hear how she talks to me? Amy turned to her brother, trying to play the victim. Amy, enough. Rebecca's right. You can't keep doing this, Ben said, surprising me with his firmness. Amy's eyes narrowed, but she forced a smile. Fine, I'll find somewhere else to stay. I'm sorry, Amy, but it's for the best, Ben said, standing his ground. As Amy left, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This was only a temporary victory, and I knew she would be back. But for now, we had our weekend house, and I hoped it would be enough to remind Ben of what really mattered. We'll have a great weekend, Ben said softly, taking my hand. I hope so, I replied, squeezing his hand. We need this. It had only been a few days since our brief weekend reprieve. That morning, I walked into the living room to find Ben pacing back and forth, cell phone pressed to his ear. His face was tense, lined with worry. She lost her job and apartment, I heard him say. My heart sank. She what? I interrupted, eyes wide with disbelief. Ben held up a hand, signaling for me to wait. Yeah, okay, I'll come get you. He hung up and faced me, his expression filled with concern. Amy's in trouble, Rebecca. She lost her job and her place. She needs somewhere to stay. She said it's temporary. I don't believe this, I said, anger boiling up inside me. She always needs something. When will it end? Rebecca, she's my sister. I can't just leave her out there, Ben argued. But this isn't fair to us, Ben. We've done more than enough for her, I insisted, crossing my arms. I know, but she's family. Just for a little while, I promise. Gripping the back of a chair, I took a deep breath. Fine, but it better be temporary. Ben nodded and quickly left to pick her up. A couple of hours later, Amy walked in, her face looking worn but with that familiar smirk playing at the corners of her lips. Thanks for letting me stay, you guys, she said, dropping her bags by the couch. I bit my tongue, forcing a smile. Amy, if you're going to stay here, you need to follow the house rules. Oh, of course, Amy said sweetly, though her eyes betrayed her insincerity. Days turned into weeks, and soon it felt like Amy was becoming a permanent fixture in our home. She claimed she was looking for jobs, but more often than not, she was lounging around, watching TV. Any luck with the job search? I asked one afternoon, unable to hide the sarcasm in my voice. Amy barely looked up from her phone. Not yet. It's tough out there. It's been a month, Amy. You need to put in more effort, I said, trying to restrain my frustration. Do you think you could maybe ease off, Rebecca? She snapped back, glaring at me. I'm doing my best. Ben walked in just as the argument was escalating. What's going on? Amy's been here for a month already, Ben. She needs to find a job and move out, I said firmly. I'm trying, Ben, but she's constantly on my case, Amy said, her voice dripping with false innocence. Ben sighed, looking torn. Amy, you do need to find a solution soon. This was supposed to be temporary. Yeah, I know. I'm working on it, Amy replied, a hint of annoyance in her tone. Later that night, I confronted Ben in our bedroom. She's exploiting your kindness, Ben. She's not trying to leave. I know it's hard, but she's still my sister, Ben said, his voice weary. I just need more time to figure out what to do. If she stays any longer, it's going to hurt us, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Ben sighed deeply. I'll talk to her again. We'll figure this out. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of Amy moving around in the next room, I realized that talk alone wouldn't solve this. I had to take a stand, not just for my sake, but for our marriage. A few days after our tense conversation, I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Amy's presence in our home was driving a wedge between Ben and me, and I was determined to get to the bottom of her manipulations. I needed proof. One morning, when Amy had gone out for a supposed job interview, I sat down at Ben's computer. With a mix of guilt and resolve, I started sifting through their shared bank statements and emails. It didn't take long for the patterns to emerge. Amy's constant withdrawals, extravagant purchases, all under the guise of needing help. I heard the front door open and quickly closed the browser. Amy walked in, looking far too cheerful for someone supposedly struggling. "How was the interview?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Oh, you know how it is," she replied flippantly. "They said they'd call me." That evening, after Ben got home, I waited for Amy to head to her room before approaching him. "Ben, we need to talk," I said, my voice hushed but urgent. "About what?" he asked, already sensing my serious tone. "I've been looking into things," I began, pulling out the printed bank statements. "Amy hasn't been honest with us. Look at these withdrawals, these purchases. She's been manipulating you, Ben." Ben's face paled as he scanned the pages. "She said she needed help with basic expenses. I didn't know. I know she's your sister, but she's been lying to us," I said softly but firmly. Ben shook his head, disbelief and hurt in his eyes. "Why would she do this?" "I think she's taking advantage of your kindness. She knows you'll always come to her rescue," I said. "But this has to stop, Ben, for us." I need to talk to her," he said, still processing the shock. That night, as we sat down for dinner, Ben decided it was time to confront Amy. I could tell he was nervous, but he had to face the truth. "Amy, we need to talk about your situation here," Ben said, his voice steady but strained. "What do you mean?" Amy asked, her eyes narrowing. "Rebecca found some things today," Ben said, sliding the bank statements across the table. "You've been using my money to fund your lifestyle. This isn't just about rent or food." Amy's face flushed with anger. "How dare you snoop through my personal business?" she yelled, glaring at me. "It's our business when you're exploiting us," I shot back. "You need to leave, Amy. This can't go on." Ben nodded, finally standing firm. "Rebecca's right. You need to find another place to stay. We can't do this anymore." Amy's expression twisted with rage and desperation. "You're choosing her over me? Your own sister?" "I have to put my marriage first, Amy," that Ben said quietly but resolutely. "You need to go." Amy stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. "I'm proud of you," I said to Ben, reaching out to hold his hand. "We'll get through this," he replied, squeezing my hand. As we sat in the quiet of our now peaceful home, I knew that this was just the beginning. Amy's departure would bring challenges, but it was a necessary step towards reclaiming our lives. And this time, I was ready for whatever came next. Amy's departure left a palpable void in the house, but the tension between Ben and me had only slightly eased. The damage had been done, and trust had been breached. I knew I had to take additional steps to ensure that Amy's presence in our lives was permanently diminished. One evening, an idea struck me. I needed to gather irrefutable evidence of Amy's deceit. I decided to lay a trap. If Amy's true nature was exposed in front of friends and family, it would become impossible for Ben to continue making excuses for her. "Ben, I've been thinking," I said while making dinner. "We should throw a surprise birthday party for you next week. A nice gathering with our close friends and family." "A party?" Ben seemed hesitant. "With everything going on?" "Yes, exactly because of that," I insisted. "We need something good to bring people together. Plus, it'll be fun." After a little more convincing, Ben agreed. The plan was set into motion. I sent out invitations and made sure Amy got the information. Next, I concocted a plan with a few close friends to help gather more concrete proof of Amy's manipulations. On the day of the party, our house was filled with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses. I moved through the rooms, greeting guests and setting everything in place. Amy arrived late, fashionably dressed, but with an air of entitlement that made my blood boil. The moment came when I took the stage, tapping a glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," I began, smiling at Ben, who looked slightly uncomfortable. "Today we celebrate not just Ben's birthday, but the people who matter most in our lives." I gestured subtly to my friend Laura, who nodded and started projecting the documents I had gathered. Bank statements, emails, credit card bills, all with Amy's name and traces of her lies popped up on the screen. "Amy, why don't you tell everyone about these?" I said, my voice calm but firm. Amy turned white, her eyes narrowing into slits. "What is this? How dare you?" she spat, facing the crowd. The room fell silent as everyone's eyes shifted from the screen to Amy. Ben rose, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "Ben, this is a setup," Amy cried, looking wounded. "They're lying." Ben shook his head, finally seeing the reality of her deceit. Amy, these are your statements. You've been lying to us all along. This isn't fair, Amy snarled, her mask slipping. You can't do this. I'm your sister. I think it's time you leave, Ben said quietly but with finality in his voice. Mutters of agreement filled the room as Amy stormed out, furious and humiliated. Once the door slammed shut behind her, the tension in the room eased, replaced by a sense of relief and vindication. You didn't have to do it this way, Ben said, his eyes meeting mine. This was the only way you would see the truth, Ben, I replied softly but firmly. She couldn't keep hurting us. The rest of the evening continued, subdued but supportive. Our friends and family rallied around us, offering comfort and understanding. As I looked around at the people who truly mattered, I felt a sense of closure. Ben and I stood together near the end of the party, hand in hand. Thank you for standing by me, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. We are stronger together, I replied, holding on to him tightly. And with that, we began the slow, steady process of healing and rebuilding our lives, free from the deceptive shadow of Amy. In the days following the party, Amy's exposure became the talk of our social circle. As relieved as I was to finally have the truth out, I knew the fallout was far from over. Ben was still grappling with the betrayal, and despite his firm stand at the party, he remained conflicted. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Ben's phone rang. He glanced at it, sighed, and picked it up. It's Amy. I braced myself, listening to his side of the conversation. Amy, this isn't the time. No, you need to understand. No, I can't keep doing this. You need help, Amy. Goodbye. He hung up, looking drained. She's still trying to play the victim, he said, his voice filled with frustration. I'm not surprised, I said. But you did the right thing, Ben. We need to focus on us now. Ben nodded but looked lost. It's just hard to turn my back on her after all these years. I reached out and took his hand. You're not turning your back on her, Ben. You're setting boundaries. There's a difference. A couple of days later, we decided it was time to publicly confront the situation with our friends and family once and for all. We gathered them at our house for a straightforward discussion. I know everyone has heard bits and pieces about what happened with Amy, Ben began, his voice steady but emotional. I want to clear the air and explain why we had to take such drastic steps. I stood by his side, feeling his hand tighten around mine for support. Amy has been manipulating us for a long time. When we put the evidence together, it was clear she was taking advantage of Ben's kindness and our resources. There were murmurs of agreement and disbelief among the group. Our friends and family exchanged looks of sympathy and understanding. Ben's eyes scanned the room, filled with a mixture of apology and resolution. I've realized that protecting her all these years only enabled her behavior. It was time to make a change. At that moment, the front door burst open. Amy stood there, her face flushed with anger. How dare you? You're lying to everyone, she screamed. Gasps filled the room and all eyes turned toward Amy. I felt my heart race, but I stood my ground. Amy, you need to leave, I said firmly. No, I'm setting the record straight, she shouted. They've turned everyone against me with their lies. Amy, you've done this to yourself, Ben said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. We have the proof. Everyone has seen it. You think you can just cut me out of your life? Amy spat, her eyes wild. I'll find a way back, you'll see. No, you won't, Ben replied with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. You need to get help, Amy. Until then, you are no longer welcome here. Amy's face twisted with rage, but she could see the resolve in Ben's eyes. With one last venomous glare, she stormed out. The room remained silent, the weight of the confrontation lingering in the air. Thank you all for being here, I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. It's been a difficult journey, but with your support, we can move forward. Our friends and family approached us individually, offering hugs and words of comfort. As the evening came to a close, Ben and I stood together, emotionally exhausted but stronger for having faced the storm head-on. We did the right thing, but Ben whispered, his voice strained but certain. We did, I replied, leaning into him. We both knew that while the road to healing would be long, we were finally on the right path, together. The days following Amy's explosive exit from our home were a complex blend of relief and lingering tension. Ben and I tried to find our footing again, the house quiet without Amy's disruptive presence. One evening, as Ben and I sat quietly on the porch, sipping tea, He turned to me. Rebecca, I know it's been hard on both of us. I want to thank you for standing by me through everything. I nodded, feeling his sincerity. We are in this together, Ben. Always. Just as we were embracing a moment of peace, the piercing sound of the doorbell interrupted us. I exchanged a glance with Ben, sensing something was off. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Amy. Her eyes were red, but it wasn't sorrow I saw there, it was fury. What are you doing here, Amy? Ben asked. His voice has a mix of concern and frustration. I'm here because you're my brother, and you're all I have left, she replied, her tone shifting to one of desperation. Amy, we've been through this. You need help we can't give you, I said, standing firm. Amy's eyes narrowed, and her voice turned venomous. So it's her or me, huh, Ben? Choose. Ben's face grew pale. Amy, please don't do this. Do what? Make you choose? You always choose her, don't you? Amy spat, her words slicing through the air. Amy. That's not fair, Ben replied, his voice shaking. It's not about choosing sides. You need to take responsibility. Responsibility? Amy scoffed. You're my brother. You promised to take care of me? There was a painful silence. I could see Ben's internal struggle written all over his face. He took a deep breath and stood taller. Amy, I love you, but you have to leave, Ben said quietly but firmly. You cannot keep coming back when things don't go your way. You're hurting yourself and us. Amy's face twisted in rage. You're throwing me away for her. I'll destroy you both. You need to leave, Amy, I said, my voice hardening. Now. With a last hate-filled glare, Amy stormed out of our lives once more, leaving us standing in a tense, heavy silence. As the darkness settled around us, I turned to Ben, seeing the pain in his eyes. Ben, we did what we had to, I said, trying to comfort him. I know, he replied, their voices trembling. It doesn't make it hurt any less. We went back inside, closing the door to the night and, symbolically, to Amy's toxic influence. There was a sadness in the air, but for the first time there was also a glimmer of hope. Ben, we'll get through this, I said, taking his hand. He nodded, squeezing my hand in return. Yes, we will, together. As we sat back on the couch, the quiet of our home felt strangely comforting. The journey had been rough, but the future now seemed a little less daunting. Together we were ready to rebuild what had been broken and look forward to a life free from Amy's shadow. Amy's departure marked a turning point for us. The house was calmer, and Ben and I were tentatively stepping into the healing process. Each morning felt lighter, but the memory of Amy's threats still loomed. One weekend, Ben and I decided to repaint the living room. It was a small act of reclaiming our space. As we worked, I sensed the unspoken tension easing with each stroke of the brush. This is therapeutic, Ben remarked, dipping his roller into the paint. Yeah, it feels like a fresh start, I replied, smiling. Later that week, Ben came home with a rare smile on his face. I got a promotion at work today, he announced. That's amazing, I said, wrapping my arms around him. Congratulations, Ben. Thanks, Rebecca, he said, his eyes sparkling. I couldn't have done it without your support. Our lives slowly began to stabilize. Yet, despite the progress, Amy's presence wasn't entirely gone. Sometimes we'd hear snippets about her from mutual acquaintances. Most of it wasn't good. Job rejections, broken relationships. Her manipulations had caught up with her. One evening, as we prepared dinner, Ben's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and turned pale. It's from Peter, Amy's ex-boyfriend. What does he want? I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. He says Amy's really hit rock bottom. She's been reaching out to people, begging for help, but no one trusts her anymore, Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. Ben, you did everything you could, I said softly. She's facing the consequences of her actions. He nodded, eyes distant. I know, it's just hard to see her like this, even after everything. A few days later, while out grocery shopping, we ran into Jeff, my dad. He gave us both a tight hug. How are things, kids? We're doing better, Dad, I said. Jeff looked at Ben with a fatherly warmth. You two have been through the ringer, but I see you're coming out stronger. It's been tough, but we're getting there, Ben replied. As the weeks rolled by, the distance from Amy's toxic presence became more tangible. Our marriage felt renewed. We were rediscovering each other in ways we hadn't been able to before. On a quiet Sunday morning, Ben turned to me as we sipped our coffee on the porch. Rebecca, I know I've said this before, but I need you to understand just how much your support means to me. His words filled me with warmth. We're a team, Ben, and we'll get through anything together. Just then our neighbor Carol leaned over the fence. Morning, beautiful day, isn't it? Sure is, Carol, I responded, smiling. Carol looked hesitant but spoke up. I heard about Amy. Must have been hard, but you did the right thing, Rebecca. Thank you, Carol, Ben said, his voice filled with gratitude. As the days turned into months, the echoes of Amy's manipulations faded. We were rebuilding our lives, stronger and more united. Each step forward was a reminder that we had the strength to overcome anything, together. With every sunrise, our future felt brighter. The lessons of the past had made us resilient, and though the scars might remain, we were ready to embrace the new chapters of our story. I'm inviting her to be with my son. You can't even have kids, Sharon, can you? Nancy's voice cut through the air like a knife. My heart pounded, and I could feel my face flush with a mixture of anger and shame. I glanced at Kyle, hoping for a flicker of support, but he sat silently beside the younger woman, Diana, with a quiet acceptance in his eyes. Nancy, this is not the time or place, I managed to say, my voice quivering despite my best efforts to stay composed. We were seated around the lavish dining table in the Benson's sprawling Pasadena estate, the room suffused with an uncomfortable tension. Nancy leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. We have to face reality, Sharon. Kyle deserves to be happy, and Diana here could make him a father. I stole another look at Kyle, but he remained stoic, his gaze focused somewhere in the distance. Diana, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly aware of the awkwardness, but not willing to challenge Nancy. I can't believe you're just sitting there, letting her talk to me like this, I said to Kyle, my voice breaking. He finally looked at me, but there was no warmth, no reassurance in his eyes. Sharon, we've talked about this, he said softly. This is about the future. Whose future? I demanded. Certainly not ours. Nancy leaned forward, her eyes glinting. Sharon, our family has a legacy to uphold. It's not just about you and Kyle. It's about the Bensons' name and standing. My mind raced. The Bensons had always prided themselves on their social status. Affluent, influential, respected. But at what cost? I had sacrificed so much to fit into their world. And here Nancy was, ready to cast me aside the moment I couldn't fulfill their so-called legacy. I can't do this, I said, pushing away from the table. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. I turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. Stepping outside, I found myself in the garden, the cool evening air hitting my face. The tears I had held back now flowed freely. This wasn't just about a family legacy, it was about my worth, my identity, and everything I had believed in. A moment later, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind me. I wiped my tears hastily, not wanting to look weak. Kyle appeared, his expression conflicted. Sharon, please, he began. Please what, Kyle? I interrupted. Please accept your mother's plan to replace me because I can't give her a grandchild? I don't know what you expect me to do, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. Nancy's always been controlling, but she's also right about the pressure we're under. She's tearing us apart, Kyle, I said, trying to make him see the reality. Is this what you want, to replace me without even giving us a real chance? He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I just want what's best for everyone. You mean what's best for Nancy and her precious legacy, I spat. But what about me, Kyle? What about us? Kyle ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. I don't know, Sharon. I'm just trying to navigate this the best I can. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Navigate? You've been silent while your mother and Diana plot to replace me. That's not navigating, that's surrendering. He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, but I pulled away. I can't do this alone, Kyle. If you won't stand up for us, for me, then what's the point? He sighed heavily but said nothing more. The silence between us spoke volumes. As I walked back into the house to gather my things, a painful clarity washed over me. This was a battle I had to fight on my own, whether Kyle stood by my side or not. And if I had learned anything from Nancy's ruthless games, it was that sometimes you had to build your own strength and reclaim your story, one painful step at a time. The next morning, the tension from last night still hung in the air like a storm cloud. I sat at the breakfast table, trying to gather my thoughts. Nancy walked in, her presence filling the room with an air of superiority. Sharon, she began, her voice sweet but with an edge. I've been thinking. We need to consider the future. A guest house attached to the main property seems like a perfect solution, don't you agree? I looked up, unprepared for this. A guest house? For whom? For future guests, of course, she said dismissively. Like Diana. She'll need a place to stay when she visits. My heart sank. Diana was already being treated like part of the family. How could Nancy be so bold? And who will pay for this guest house? I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. Nancy smiled, a predatory grin that made my blood boil. We've already discussed it. You and Kyle will contribute significantly. After all, it's for the future of the family. Discussed it? I asked, my voice rising. Kyle never mentioned this to me. Nancy cocked her head, feigning innocence. Oh, he didn't? Maybe he thought you'd be against it. I clenched my fists under the table. This was another scheme to undermine me, to chip away at my role in this family. Kyle walked in and sensed the tension immediately. What's going on? He asked, looking between Nancy and me. Your mother seems to think we should build a guest house, I said, my voice barely controlled. Oh, right, Kyle said, avoiding my eyes. I thought I told you. No, Kyle, you didn't. Frustration and hurt welled up inside me. When did you decide this without me? Sharon, it's not a big deal, Kyle replied weakly. It's just a guest house. Not a big deal. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't about a guest house. It's about you letting your mother control our lives. Our future. Nancy watched with a smug expression, reveling in the chaos she'd sown. Now, Sharon, let's not be dramatic. It's just practical. Practical? I repeated, incredulous. Or just another way to push me out? Kyle sighed, rubbing his temples. Can't we just talk about this calmly? I shook my head in disbelief. There's nothing left to talk about if you're not willing to stand up for us, for me. The room fell silent. I looked at Kyle, hoping against hope he would finally stand by my side. But his silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Fine, I said, my voice breaking. If that's how you feel, then do whatever you want. But don't expect my help either financially or emotionally. Turning on my heel, I walked out of the room, the weight of betrayal heavier than ever. With each step, my resolve hardened. If Nancy wanted a fight, she would get one. And this time, I wouldn't be the one to back down. Weeks passed by, filled with an uneasy silence between Kyle and me. We spoke only when necessary, the house echoing with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Nancy continued her schemes, now more brazen with Diana's frequent visits. One morning, as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I felt an odd sensation. Dizzy, I grabbed the counter for support. The room spun and nausea welled up inside me. I took a deep breath, hoping it would pass, but it didn't. Later that day, I decided to see my doctor. Sitting in the sterile room, I felt a mix of dread and hope. Was it possible that? Dr. Harris walked in with a smile. Sharon, I have some news for you. You're pregnant. The words took a moment to sink in. Pregnant. After all the turmoil, this news felt like a beacon of hope. Back home, I found Kyle in his office. Kyle, we need to talk, I said, my voice unsteady with excitement. He looked up wary. What is it, Sharon? I'm pregnant, I said, unable to keep the smile off my face. For a moment, I saw a flicker of emotion pass through his eyes. Relief? Happiness? I couldn't tell. That's great news, he said finally, but his tone lacked the enthusiasm I'd hoped for. We're going to have a baby, Kyle. This changes everything, I said, hoping he would understand the significance. Yeah, it does, he agreed, but the words seemed hollow. News of the pregnancy spread quickly. Nancy was surprisingly elated, her demeanor suddenly softer. Sharon, darling, this is wonderful news, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. A baby changes everything. Our legacy is secure. I should have been thrilled by her approval, but instead, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Nancy's plans were always self-serving. As the months passed, Nancy's manipulations grew subtler but more invasive. She constantly hinted at how Kyle should think about the future, about the baby's role within the family. It was clear she saw the baby as another pawn in her games. One evening, I overheard a conversation between Nancy and Kyle in the living room. Kyle, you must ensure Sharon is on board with our plans for the baby. We need to think about the Bensons' future, she said. Kyle sighed. Mom, Sharon's been through enough. Can't we just be happy and support her? Nancy's voice hardened. Support her? This isn't just about her. The baby is our future. Sharon needs to fall in line with that. That was the last straw. I stepped into the room, my anger boiling over. Nancy, this baby is our child, not a bargaining chip for your legacy. Nancy's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her composure. I am thinking of the family, Sharon. Don't forget, you're part of this family too. I haven't forgotten, I replied coldly. But this is my baby, our baby, and I won't let you manipulate Kyle or me anymore. Kyle looked between us, clearly conflicted. Sharon, let's just try to work this out calmly. Calmly? I repeated, unable to contain my frustration. How can I be calm when your mother is trying to control every aspect of our lives? Nancy's facade dropped, her true nature revealing itself. Perhaps if you were more cooperative, things would be easier for everyone. I think it's time you leave, I said, my voice firm. You've meddled enough in our lives. This is our family, and we'll make our own decisions. Nancy's expression hardened, but she said nothing as she turned and left. Kyle looked at me, torn. Sharon, I don't know what to do. Support me, I said, tears welling up. Support our baby. Stand by us, Kyle. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of the man I once loved. But only time would tell if that glimmer could lead us through the shadows Nancy had cast over our lives. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism. Nancy kept her distance, and Kyle made an effort to be more supportive. But the fragile peace didn't last long. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, a sharp pain shot through my abdomen. I gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. Kyle rushed to my side. Sharon, what's wrong? I don't know, I said, my voice strained. It hurts, Kyle. It hurts so much. Panic set in as the pain intensified. Kyle helped me to the car, and we hurried to the hospital. Each minute felt like an eternity. At the hospital, the nurses quickly took me to a room. Kyle paced outside while I was examined, his face pale with worry. After what felt like hours, the doctor came out. Kyle approached him, anxiety etched on his face. Doctor, is she all right? Is the baby okay? The doctor's expression was grave. I'm sorry, Mr. Benson. Your wife had a miscarriage. Kyle staggered, his world collapsing. I lay in the hospital bed, numb. The words echoed in my mind, but it didn't feel real. How could this happen? It wasn't fair. Back home, the grief was overwhelming. Kyle was distant, retreating into himself. I felt alone, abandoned in my sorrow. Nancy came over, her presence as unwelcome as ever. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she sat with Kyle, discussing the future. Kyle, we have to focus on what's next, she said, her voice calm. You can't let this setback keep you from the big picture. Kyle glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Mom, now is not the time. Sharon needs support. I'm thinking of her too, Nancy insisted. She'll be all right, but we need to make decisions about the future. Her words were a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt. Days turned into weeks. The void left by the miscarriage was a constant reminder of my loss and Nancy's relentless interference. Kyle grew more withdrawn, leaving me to navigate my grief alone. One night, I overheard Nancy and Kyle talking in hushed tones in the living room. Curiosity and anger pushed me to eavesdrop. We need to consider other options, Kyle, Nancy was saying. What do you mean? Kyle asked, his voice tired. Diana, she replied simply. She's still willing to be part of this family, to give you a child. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could Nancy be so heartless? That's enough, I said, stepping into the room. I won't let you replace me like this. Nancy turned to me, her eyes cold. Sharon, you need to think practically. This is about the future. No, Nancy, I said, my voice trembling with anger. This is about your manipulation and control. You've already taken so much from me. I won't let you take Kyle too. Kyle looked helpless, caught between us. Sharon, it's not what you think, isn't it? I shot back. You're discussing replacing me with Diana as if I'm some disposable object. Nancy stood up, her face a mask of determination. You're being emotional. We need to move forward. No, I said firmly. If you continue down this path, you'll lose everything. This family isn't your puppet to control. Kyle finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. Mom, Sharon's right. We need to focus on healing, not on Diana or the guest house or any of your plans. Nancy's eyes flashed with anger, but she held her tongue. She turned and left without another word. Kyle walked over to me, putting his arms around me. I'm sorry, Sharon. I should have stood up to her sooner. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I nodded. We need to be a team, Kyle. We need to fight for us. He held me tighter, a glimmer of hope sparking in the darkness. I promise, Sharon, we'll get through this together. Despite my pain, a new resolve formed. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nancy's manipulations had pushed us to the brink, but we would stand firm. The fight for our future had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house became a constant presence. Kyle and I tried to rebuild our lives, but Nancy's presence was an ever-looming shadow. One evening, as I walked past the study, I heard voices. Curious, I paused. "Mom, this isn't the right time," Kyle was saying. "Time is exactly what we don't have," Nancy replied sharply. "Sharon isn't going to have another child, Kyle. We need to think about the future." My heart sank. She was relentless. "We need to give her some space, Mom," Kyle replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, we need to act now. Diana is ready to step in. She's been discreet, waiting in the wings," Nancy insisted. I couldn't listen any longer. I pushed open the door, anger boiling over. "How dare you, Nancy? How dare you plot behind my back?" Nancy turned to me, her face a cold mask. "Sharon, you need to accept reality. You can't provide what this family needs." "I won't let you replace me," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "This is my home, my marriage." Kyle looked stricken, caught between us again. "Sharon, please." "No, Kyle," I interrupted. "Your mother needs to understand that I won't be pushed out of the way." Nancy stepped forward, her eyes glinting with malice. "You're being irrational, Sharon. This is about family legacy, something you clearly don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I shot back. "You're using Diana to manipulate this family for your own ends." "She's what's best for this family," Nancy insisted. "No," I said, my voice firm. "Family is about love and support, not control and manipulation. You've poisoned this household with your schemes." Kyle finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, Sharon's right. We need to stop this." Nancy's face twisted with anger. "You're making a mistake, Kyle. A mistake that will destroy everything we've built." "I'd rather lose everything than keep living like this," Kyle said, his voice gaining strength. "Sharon and I will handle our lives without your interference." Nancy glared at him, then at me. "You'll regret this, both of you." She stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. I turned to Kyle, tears in my eyes. "Thank you." He nodded, his face a mix of sorrow and resolve. "It's time we take control of our lives, Sharon." The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't continue living under Nancy's shadow. I needed to reclaim my independence and build a future free from her manipulations. "Kyle, I think it's time we took a break," I said, my heart heavy but determined. He looked at me, pain in his eyes. "Sharon, are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I need to find myself again, to rebuild my life on my own terms." Kyle nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll support you, whatever you need." As I packed my things, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what could have been, but relief that I was finally taking a stand. When I left the house, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I called my best friend Jessica, who immediately offered her support. "Sharon, you're doing the right thing. You need to focus on yourself now." That night, as I lay in a small apartment far from the mansion's oppressive walls, I felt a spark of hope. Nancy might have thought she had won, but this was far from over. I vowed to reclaim what was mine, to expose Nancy's deceit, and to rebuild my life on my own terms. The fight was just beginning, and I was ready for the battle ahead. I spent the next few days regrouping at Jessica's place. Over coffee, I laid out everything that had happened. Jessica listened, her expression growing more concerned with each word. "Sharon, it's time you took action," she said firmly. "Nancy's hold over Kyle and their family is toxic. We need a plan." Jessica introduced me to Brandon Wilson, a sharp-eyed lawyer known for his no-nonsense approach. We met at his office, where he leaned back in his chair, studying me intently. "So, tell me everything," he said. I relayed the whole saga, the incessant manipulations, the betrayal, and Nancy's schemes. Brandon took notes, his expression serious. "Sharon, you have a solid case," he said finally. "But to make this work, we need evidence of Nancy's manipulations, especially if they've impacted the family's finances." I nodded, determined. "Tell me what to do." Over the next few weeks, we gathered evidence. I reached out to old friends and acquaintances, piecing together a pattern of Nancy's control over the family and their wealth. Jessica helped me navigate through the emotional toll, her unwavering support a lifeline. The breaking point came one afternoon when I discovered documents revealing Nancy had funneled family funds into personal accounts under Diana's name. Armed with this crucial evidence, we prepared for the legal battle ahead. The day of the confrontation arrived. Brandon and I walked into the Bensons' estate, documents in hand. Nancy, Kyle, and Diana were already there, their expressions a mix of curiosity and irritation. Nancy sneered as we entered. "What is this all about, Sharon?" Brandon stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We're here to discuss the misappropriation of family funds and the manipulations perpetrated by you, Nancy." The room fell silent. Nancy's face twisted in anger. "This is absurd," she spat. "How dare you accuse me?" "We have proof," Brandon said, laying out the documents on the table. "Records of financial transactions, testimonies from people who've witnessed your manipulations. You've been siphoning funds and using Diana to secure your hold over the family." Kyle's face paled as he scanned the documents. "Mom, what is this?" Nancy glared at me. "This is a setup. She's trying to destroy us." "No, Nancy," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm trying to reclaim what's rightfully mine and expose your deceit. You've manipulated this family for too long." Kyle stumbled back, his world unraveling. "I can't believe this. Mom, how could you?" Nancy's facade finally cracked. "I did it for you, for the family." "At what cost?" Kyle shouted, anger and betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You've destroyed everything." Diana quietly slipped out, not wanting to be part of the downfall. Brandon gathered the documents, his expression satisfied. "This will hold up in court." Nancy slumped into a chair, deflated. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Kyle turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. "Sharon, I'm so sorry. I should have seen through her lies." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. "We have a long road ahead, Kyle, but we can rebuild." The legal battle that followed was intense. However, with Brandon's expertise and the irrefutable evidence, Nancy's hold over the family crumbled. The truth about her manipulations and misdeeds came to light, and she faced the consequences. Kyle and I began to see glimmers of a future free from Nancy's influence. It wasn't easy, and the pain from past wounds lingered, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. As I walked out of the courthouse one final time, the sun shining brighter than it had in months, I felt a renewed sense of strength. The battle wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and the future I deserved. And for the first time, that future looked promising. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers as the judge called the session to order. Every bench was filled, curious eyes trained on our little drama. Nancy sat beside her lawyer, her face a mask of defiance. Kyle and I sat together, a unified front, ready to face whatever came our way. The judge looked at the gathered documents and then at Nancy. "The evidence presented is quite damning, Mrs. Benson. You've manipulated not only your family's finances, but also their lives. How do you respond?" Nancy's lawyer stood, trying to draw the conversation in a different direction. "Your Honor, my client has always acted in the best interest of her family. These accusations are exaggerated." Brandon rose smoothly, placing another document before the judge. "Your Honor, these aren't exaggerated claims. We have clear evidence of where the family money has gone. Mrs. Benson used her position to control and manipulate her son's family for her personal gain." Nancy glared at me, venom in her gaze. "This is your doing, Sharon. You've always been weak, and now you're trying to ruin us." I felt a rush of anger, but kept my voice calm. "No, Nancy, the truth is ruining you. Your deeds are finally coming to light." The judge signaled for silence and reviewed the documents again. "It appears the evidence is irrefutable. In light of these findings, this court rules in favor of Sharon Benson. Nancy Benson, you will be held accountable for your actions, including the financial restitution required." Nancy's face twisted in outrage. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at me. "You may have won this battle, but I won't let you ruin this family." Kyle, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "Mom, it's over. You need to accept the consequences of your actions. Stop this madness." Nancy looked at Kyle, her fury mixing with disbelief. "You're siding with her?" "I'm siding with the truth," Kyle replied firmly. "And it's time we all faced it." As we exited the courtroom, the media swarmed around us, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. Brandon guided us through the crowd, but not before I caught a glimpse of Nancy's face, a mixture of rage and defeat. The public reaction was swift. News of Nancy's manipulations spread through Pasadena's social circles like wildfire. Her fall from grace was rapid, ostracizing her from the society she once controlled with an iron fist. Days turned into weeks, and the shockwaves of the trial continued to ripple. I received messages of support, people who had seen the news and admired my stand. For the first time in a long while, I felt a community rallying around me instead of alienating me. One evening, Kyle and I sat in the living room of our now quieter home. "How are you holding up?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "I'm okay," I replied truthfully. "For the first time in a while, I feel like I can breathe." Kyle nodded. "I'm sorry for everything, Sharon, for not seeing through Mom earlier, for not standing by you." I reached out and took his hand. "We can't change the past, Kyle, but we can build a better future, together." He smiled, relief evident on his face. "I'd like that." Our conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. I opened it to find Diana standing there, looking nervous. "Diana?" I asked, surprised. "I just wanted to say goodbye," she said, shifting uneasily. "I'm leaving Pasadena. I can't stay here with everything that's happened." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of closure. "Take care, Diana. I hope you find peace." She gave a small smile and walked away, another piece of the past finally letting go. As I closed the door, I felt lighter, free from the chains of manipulation and deceit that had bound me for so long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. With the truth on our side, we could face anything. The shadows that once loomed over us were finally starting to lift, revealing a brighter, more hopeful horizon. The sun streamed through the windows of my new office, a cozy space I'd rented to start my own business, a small consulting firm specializing in helping women navigate marital and financial disputes. It felt good to be here, surrounded by supportive friends and colleagues, away from the toxic environment that had once suffocated me. Jessica walked in, a box of files in her hands. "Sharon, you have a visitor," she said, her tone curious. "Who is it?" I asked, looking up from my desk. "It's Nancy," Jessica replied, her eyes filled with concern. I felt a pang of anxiety but steadied myself. "Let her in." Nancy entered, her once commanding presence diminished. She looked smaller, almost fragile. "Sharon, I came to talk," she said, her voice lacking its usual venom. "Go ahead," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I came to apologize," she began, her eyes avoiding mine. "I never saw the damage I was causing. I thought I was protecting the family." I studied her, looking for sincerity. "Nancy, you caused a lot of pain, not just to me, but to Kyle and our unborn child. Apologies are a start, but they won't erase the past." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I've lost so much, my reputation, my family's trust. I just want to make amends." I took a deep breath. "Nancy, making amends means accepting responsibility and letting go of control. Can you do that?" She hesitated, but then nodded. "I'm willing to try. I want to rebuild some semblance of a relationship with Kyle, and maybe, over time, with you too." "I appreciate that," I said, feeling the weight of her words, but also understanding that trust would take time. "Let's take it one step at a time." Nancy offered a weak smile. "Thank you, Sharon. I'll let you get back to your work." After she left, Jessica came back in. "That was unexpected," she remarked. "Very," I agreed, but it felt like closure. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to return to a new normal. Kyle and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship, focusing on open communication and mutual respect. Nancy kept her distance but made genuine efforts to change, attending therapy and slowly rebuilding trust with Kyle. One sunny afternoon, I received a call from Rebecca, Kyle's and my mutual friend. "Sharon, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you," she said. "You've become such a strong, independent woman. Everyone in Pasadena is talking about you, in a good way." "Thank you, Rebecca," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me. "It means a lot." Kyle and I decided to host a small gathering to celebrate newfound peace and growth. Friends and family filled our home, laughter and conversation flowing easily. It felt surreal, but wonderful. At one point, I found myself standing alone, looking out into the garden. Kyle joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," I agreed, leaning into him. "I'm proud of us." Jessica raised her glass for a toast. "To Sharon and Kyle, for showing us that with truth, resilience, and love, we can overcome anything." The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. The shadows of the past had lifted, replaced by the light of a hopeful future. As the evening wound down, Kyle and I stood side by side, watching our friends and family. "Here's to new beginnings," I said softly. "To new beginnings," Kyle echoed, squeezing my hand. The journey had been long and painful, but standing there among the people who truly cared for us, I knew we were finally free. We had risen above the manipulations and betrayals, and now the future was ours to shape, and it was looking bright. I sighed heavily as Ryan pulled me aside, his face etched with concern. "Jillian, we need to talk," he said in a hushed tone. "What's wrong?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He glanced toward the kitchen where his mother, Helen, was bustling around. "Look at those tea bags on the rack. She reuses them." I followed his gaze and felt a wave of disgust wash over me. The tea bags were indeed withered and discolored, a testament to Helen's extreme frugality. "That's disgusting! This is how your mom welcomes us?" Ryan shook his head solemnly. "I'm sorry, but you know how she is. I just wanted to warn you before you made the mistake of drinking that tea." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We had just arrived for our first visit to Ryan's childhood home, and already I was regretting it. Helen's reputation for being overly thrifty, some might say downright cheap, had preceded her, but this was a new level of absurdity. As if on cue, Helen emerged from the kitchen, a wide smile plastered on her face. "Jillian, dear, I've made us some lovely tea. Come, sit down and make yourself comfortable." I exchanged a worried glance with Ryan, but he gave me a subtle nod, silently urging me to keep the peace. Swallowing my disgust, I followed Helen into the living room and took a seat on the well-worn couch. Helen bustled about, pouring the tea into chipped mugs. "I hope you like it," she said, handing me a cup. "I always make sure to get my money's worth out of those tea bags." I forced a smile, gripping the mug tightly. "Thank you, Helen. It smells interesting." Ryan cleared his throat, attempting to steer the conversation in a different direction. "So, Mom, how have you been? It's been a while since we last visited." Helen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know me, just pinching pennies wherever I can. Speaking of which, Jillian, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to take your shoes off before walking on the carpet. I like to keep things tidy without spending money on expensive cleaners." I fought the urge to roll my eyes, silently wondering what other indignities awaited me during this visit. As I slipped off my shoes, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping in. If this was just the beginning, how much worse could things get? A few weeks after the tea incident, Ryan and I started planning our wedding. I was excited to finally tie the knot, but Helen's presence loomed like a dark cloud over the joyous occasion. "Mom, we're thinking of having the ceremony at the church downtown," Ryan said during one of our planning sessions at Helen's place. Helen pursed her lips disapprovingly. "That sounds like an unnecessary expense. Why don't you have it here in the backyard? I can make all the decorations myself from recycled materials." I cringed at the thought of a backyard wedding adorned with repurposed junk. "Thank you for the offer, Helen, but we'd prefer something a bit more traditional." "Suit yourself," Helen said with a shrug. "But don't expect me to contribute financially. I'm on a fixed income, and every penny counts." Ryan shot me an apologetic look, but I was already seething inside. It was one thing for Helen to be frugal with her own money, but to refuse to contribute anything towards her only son's wedding felt like a slap in the face. "That's fine, Helen," I said through gritted teeth. "We'll figure it out ourselves." Later that evening, as Ryan and I discussed potential venues, I couldn't help but vent my frustrations. "Can you believe your mother?" I said, my voice rising with each word. "Not only does she expect us to have a tacky homemade wedding, but she won't even chip in a dime towards it." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. She's always been like this. I'm sorry, Jillian. I wish there was something I could do." "Well, there is something you can do," I said, an idea forming in my mind. "You can stand up to her for once. This is our wedding, and we should have it the way we want, without her constant criticism and penny pinching." Ryan looked torn, his loyalty to his mother clashing with his desire to please me. "I'll try talking to her again," he said finally. "But you know how stubborn she can be." I nodded, already feeling the seeds of resentment taking root. If Helen wasn't going to cooperate, then I would have to find a way to make her see reason, even if it meant playing hardball. As the weeks went by, the wedding planning only grew more stressful. Helen consistently shot down our ideas, insisting on cheaper alternatives that lacked any semblance of elegance or class. I found myself constantly at odds with her, and Ryan was caught in the middle, desperately trying to keep the peace. One particularly heated argument erupted when Helen suggested I wear an old wedding dress that she would remodel for me. "Absolutely not," I shouted, my patience finally snapping. "This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and I refuse to look like a ragamuffin because you're too cheap to let me buy a proper dress." Helen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch your tone, young lady. I'm only trying to save you money." "Well, we don't need your kind of saving," I spat back. "If you're not going to support us, then maybe you shouldn't be involved at all." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hurt in Helen's eyes. But just as quickly her expression hardened, and she turned her back on me without another word. As the tension in the room threatened to suffocate us, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a long, bitter battle, and I was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. Tensions reached a boiling point during a pre-wedding family dinner. My parents, Louise and Robert, had come over to Helen's place to discuss the final arrangements. As we gathered around the table, Helen wasted no time in making her opinions known. "I still think a backyard wedding would be the most economical choice," she said, her tone smug. I felt my jaw clench, but before I could respond, my mother spoke up. Jillian deserves to have the wedding of her dreams," she said, her speech slightly slurred due to her impairment. Helen's eyes narrowed as she regarded my mother. "Well, I'm sure she would if she had the money for it," she said pointedly. My father bristled at the implied insult. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Helen shrugged unapologetically. "I'm just saying, not everyone can afford to splurge on extravagant affairs." I could feel the tension in the room escalating rapidly. Ryan shot me a pleading look, silently begging me to defuse the situation. "Mom, that's enough," he said, turning to Helen. "We've already discussed our plans, and we're sticking to them." But Helen was relentless, her eyes glinting with a malicious gleam. "Well, if you ask me, it's a waste of money. But I suppose that's easy for you to say when you're not the one footing the bill." My father slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Listen here, you old bat," he snarled, his face flushed with anger. "We've worked hard our entire lives to provide for our daughter, and we'll be damned if we let you disrespect us like this." The room fell deathly silent, everyone holding their breath in anticipation of Helen's response. For a moment, I thought she might back down, but then her lips curved into a smug smile. "Well, it's no wonder Jillian turned out the way she did, with a foul-mouthed brute like you as her father," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. That was the final straw. My mother burst into tears, and my father leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Ryan quickly stepped between them, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Enough," he shouted, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mom, you've gone too far this time. I won't have you insulting Jillian's family like that." Helen scoffed, seemingly unfazed by the chaos she had caused. "I'm only speaking the truth," she said dismissively. I watched in stunned silence as my father struggled to regain his composure, his body shaking with barely contained fury. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, things would never be the same between our families. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan and I walked my parents to their car in tense silence. Once they had driven away, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "I'm so sorry, Jillian," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I never thought she would stoop so low." I shook my head, fighting back tears of my own. "Don't apologize for her," I said, my voice trembling. "This is who she is, a bitter, miserable woman who takes pleasure in tearing others down." Ryan pulled me into a tight embrace, and for a moment I allowed myself to find solace in his warmth. But deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a long, bitter battle, one that would test the very limits of our love and resolve. As we stood there, locked in each other's arms, I couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be a way to heal the wounds that Helen had inflicted. But one thing was certain. I would stop at nothing to protect my family, even if it meant going to war with the woman who had given birth to my husband. After the disastrous family dinner, Ryan and I decided to put some distance between us and his mother for a while. We focused on our upcoming wedding, determined not to let Helen's bitterness ruin our special day. A few months later, I gave birth to our beautiful daughter, Lily. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of joy and peace wash over me. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the drama with Helen, not the stress of wedding planning, nothing. For a brief period, there was a fragile truce between us and Helen. She seemed genuinely happy to have a granddaughter, and even made an effort to be on her best behavior around us. I dared to hope that perhaps this new addition to our family would be the catalyst for change, bringing us all closer together. But as Lily grew older, Helen's true colors began to show once again. "Jillian, you really should let me babysit Lily more often," she said during one of our visits. "You know how expensive daycare can be." I bristled at her suggestion, already sensing an ulterior motive. "Thank you, Helen, but we've got it covered." She clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you can't afford it anymore." As if on cue, my mother entered the room, and Lily's face lit up with delight. "Gamma Lou," she exclaimed, using the special name she had given my mother. Helen's expression soured as Lily rushed into my mother's arms, chattering excitedly in the sign language my mother had taught her. "Really, Jillian, do you think it's wise to encourage that nonsense?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt my blood boil at her insensitive remark. "It's not nonsense, Helen," I snapped. "It's a way for Lily to communicate with her grandmother." Helen scoffed dismissively. "Well, I think it's a waste of time. She'll never get anywhere in life relying on those silly hand gestures." Before I could respond, Lily turned to Helen, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why are you being mean to Gamalu?" she asked, her voice trembling with hurt. Helen's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting Lily to understand her biting words. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her expression, but it was quickly replaced by her usual haughty demeanor. "Don't be ridiculous, child," she said dismissively. "I was merely stating a fact. Your grandmother would do well to focus on more practical skills." Lily's lip quivered, and she buried her face in my mother's shoulder, seeking comfort from Helen's cruelty. My heart broke for her, and in that moment I knew that I had to do something to protect her from the toxic influence of her own grandmother. As Helen left the room, I pulled Ryan aside, my hands shaking with barely contained rage. "This has gone on long enough," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Your mother is a poisonous influence, and I won't have her belittling my family anymore." Ryan sighed heavily, his expression weary. "I know, Jillian. Believe me, I know. But what can we do? She's my mother, and despite everything, I still love her." I shook my head adamantly. "Love or not, this behavior is unacceptable. Either she changes, or we cut her out of our lives for good." Ryan's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew I was right. For Lily's sake, we couldn't allow Helen's toxic presence to continue unchecked. As I held my daughter close, whispering soothing words in her ear, I made a silent vow. No matter what it took, I would protect her from the cruelty of her own grandmother, even if it meant severing ties with Helen forever. Despite the tension between us, Helen was still invited to Ryan and my wedding. A part of me had hoped that the joyous occasion would soften her heart and bring some semblance of peace to our fractured family. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that Helen had no intention of changing her ways. From the moment she arrived, Helen made it a point to critique every aspect of the ceremony and reception. "You spent how much on those centerpieces?" she whispered incredulously as we made our way to the head table. "You could have made those yourself with some wildflowers and mason jars." I gritted my teeth, determined not to let her ruin this special day. "Thank you for your input, Helen," I said through a forced smile. But we wanted everything to be perfect. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the disdain written all over her face. "Well, if you ask me, it's all a waste of money. But I suppose that's easy for you to say when you're not the one footing the bill." Ryan shot me a pleading look, silently begging me to let it go. But before I could respond, Helen had already moved on to her next target, the elaborate 5-tier wedding cake. "You know, back in my day, we made our own cakes," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "None of this fancy, overpriced nonsense." I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment as several heads turned in our direction. Ryan quickly stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Mom, please," he hissed, his voice strained. "Not here. Not today." But Helen was undeterred, her eyes gleaming with a perverse delight at the discomfort she was causing. As the reception wore on, her antics only grew more outrageous. When the servers began passing around hors d'oeuvres, she whipped out a small Tupperware container from her purse and started scooping them up like a squirrel hoarding nuts for winter. "What?" she said defensively when she noticed my stunned expression. "These things cost a fortune. I'm just trying to get my money's worth." I wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Around us, guests were starting to whisper and point, their faces a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment. Ryan's father, Harold, was mortified. "Helen, please," he begged, his face flushed with shame. "You're making a scene." But Helen was beyond reason, consumed by her own twisted sense of frugality. She continued to stuff her Tupperware container, oblivious to the stares and murmurs surrounding her. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan and I said our goodbyes to our guests, thanking them for sharing in our special day. But as we turned to leave, we were met with a sight that made our hearts sink. Helen standing by the exit, a smug grin on her face and a bulging Tupperware container tucked under her arm. "What?" she said innocently, catching our horrified stares. "I'm just trying to save a few bucks for the happy couple." In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to wrap my hands around her scrawny neck and throttle her. But instead, I took a deep breath and turned to Ryan, my eyes pleading with him to do something, anything, to rein in his mother's outrageous behavior. But Ryan could only shake his head, his expression one of utter defeat. It was clear that on this day, the day that was supposed to be the happiest of our lives, Helen had won. As we walked out into the night, leaving a trail of whispers and judgmental stares in our wake, I felt a cold, hard knot of resentment take root in my heart. This was supposed to be our moment, our chance to celebrate the love and commitment we shared. But once again, Helen had found a way to make it all about her and her twisted obsession with frugality. In that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. One day, somehow, I would make Helen pay for all the pain and humiliation she had caused. It might take years, even decades, but karma has a way of catching up to those who deserve it most. And when it did, I would be there to savor every delicious moment of her downfall. The air was thick with tension as we gathered at the funeral home to say goodbye to Ryan's father, Harold. What should have been a solemn occasion was quickly overshadowed by Helen's usual antics. "I can't believe the prices they charge for these things," she muttered under her breath as we filed into the viewing room. "It's highway robbery, if you ask me." I shot her a warning look, but she seemed utterly oblivious to the inappropriateness of her comments. As we took our seats, I noticed her eyes darting around the room, scanning every surface with a critical gaze. It wasn't until the service began that I realized what she was up to. As the minister spoke, delivering a heartfelt eulogy, Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a small roll of toilet paper. With a furtive glance around, she quickly stuffed it into her pocket. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Even in the face of death, Helen's obsession with frugality knew no bounds. I nudged Ryan, gesturing discreetly towards his mother, but he simply shook his head, too consumed by grief to deal with her nonsense. After the service, as we gathered in the lobby to greet mourners, Helen's behavior took an even more disturbing turn. "Did you see the spread they had set up?" she whispered to me, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "All those fancy little sandwiches and pastries? You know how much they must have spent on that." Before I could respond, she had already made a beeline for the refreshment table, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. I watched in horror as she began scooping up handfuls of food, stuffing them into her purse with reckless abandon. "Helen, what are you doing?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "This is a funeral, for God's sake." But Helen was too far gone, consumed by her own twisted sense of greed. She continued to plunder the table, oblivious to the shocked stares of the other mourners. It wasn't until Lily, my sweet, innocent daughter, caught sight of her grandmother's actions that the true extent of Helen's depravity was laid bare. "Grandma, why are you taking all that food?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Helen froze, her face flushing with embarrassment as she realized she had been caught red-handed. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by her usual defiance. "Mind your own business, child," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm just trying to save a few bucks, that's all." Lily's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her small body trembling with fear and hurt. In that moment, something inside me snapped. "That's enough, Helen," I snarled, my voice resonating with a fury I had never known before. "You've gone too far this time." Helen opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a wave of my hand. "No, don't even try to justify this," I said, my words slicing through the tense silence like a knife. "You've humiliated us for the last time." Ryan, his face etched with a mix of relief and shame, stepped forward to stand by my side. For once, he didn't try to play the peacemaker. He knew that his mother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As the whispers and stares of the other mourners washed over us, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. Finally, after years of enduring Helen's cruelty and humiliation, the tables had turned. And as she stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment and her purse stuffed with stolen goods, I knew that this was only the beginning of her downfall. The community that had once turned a blind eye to her eccentricities was now watching, their judgmental eyes scrutinizing her every move. And as word of her actions at the funeral spread, I knew that the same people who had once tolerated her would now turn against her, casting her out like the pariah she truly was. As we left the funeral home, Helen trailing behind us with her head hung in shame, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of vindication. The karma that had been building for years had finally been unleashed, and I knew that there would be no escaping its wrath. The aftermath of Helen's shameful behavior at the funeral was swift and merciless. Word of her actions spread like wildfire through our small community, and suddenly she found herself the target of scorn and ridicule from all corners. It started with the whispers and pointed stares whenever she ventured out in public. The neighbors who had once tolerated her eccentricities now regarded her with thinly veiled contempt, their eyes following her every move as if she were a common criminal. Then came the more overt acts of harassment. One morning, Helen awoke to find her front yard littered with toilet paper rolls, a cruel mockery of her theft from the funeral home. Another day, she returned from running errands to find a bag of stale bread left on her doorstep, a twisted reminder of her obsession with never letting anything go to waste. At first, Helen tried to brush off these incidents, her pride too strong to admit that she had brought this upon herself. But as the days turned into weeks and the harassment showed no signs of letting up, her defiant facade began to crack. "They're treating me like a pariah," she lamented to Ryan during one of our rare visits, "all because I was trying to save a few bucks." I couldn't help but scoff at her self-pity. "You brought this on yourself, Helen," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences for your actions?" Helen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the bitter, spiteful woman she had become. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she spat. "You've always hated me, and now you're reveling in my humiliation." I met her gaze unflinchingly, refusing to back down. "I don't hate you, Helen," I said, my voice calm and measured. "But I won't stand by and let you continue to humiliate and belittle my family." Ryan, caught in the middle as always, tried to play peacemaker. "Mom, Jillian's right," he said gently. "What you did at Dad's funeral was inexcusable. You need to take responsibility for your actions." But Helen was beyond reason, her mind twisted by years of unchecked selfishness and greed. "Take responsibility?" she spat. "For what? Trying to save a few bucks in this overpriced world?" I shook my head in disgust, realizing that reasoning with her was a lost cause. As we left her house that day, the weight of her isolation seemed to press down on us like a heavy blanket. In the weeks that followed, the harassment only intensified. Neighbors who had once been content to ignore Helen's quirks now went out of their way to make her life miserable. Insults were hurled, property was vandalized, and more than once the police had to be called to calm the situation. Through it all, Helen remained stubbornly defiant, refusing to acknowledge the role her own actions had played in her downfall. But I could see the toll it was taking on her. The way her shoulders slumped a little more each day, the haunted look in her eyes as she ventured out into a world that had turned against her. Ryan and I made it clear that she was welcome to come live with us, to escape the constant barrage of harassment and cruelty. But Helen's pride was too strong, and she steadfastly refused our offers, choosing instead to remain in her self-imposed exile. As the weeks turned into months, and the harassment showed no signs of abating, I could see the light in Helen's eyes slowly dimming. The once vibrant, if misguided woman was fading away, replaced by a shell of her former self, a bitter, broken soul consumed by the consequences of her own actions. And as I watched her spiral deeper and deeper into despair, a part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was the karma she had earned, the price she had to pay for years of cruelty and selfishness. It might have been a harsh lesson, but one that was long overdue. As the dust settled and the chaos of Helen's downfall began to fade, I found myself reflecting on how far our family had come. The turmoil we had endured, while painful, had ultimately brought us closer together, a silver lining in the midst of so much darkness. Ryan and I were expecting our second child, a son this time, and the anticipation of new life filled our hearts with hope and joy. We had made the decision for Ryan to leave his corporate job and take up freelancing, allowing him to be more present for our growing family. Lily, our sweet, precocious daughter, had blossomed into a bright and compassionate young girl. Inspired by her grandmother Louise's resilience and her passion for communication, she had taken a keen interest in sign language and was excelling in her studies. "One day, I'm going to be an interpreter," she declared one evening over dinner, her small hands moving fluidly as she signed her words. "That way, everyone can understand each other, no matter what." I couldn't help but smile at her earnest determination, so reminiscent of the woman who had instilled this love of language in her. Louise beamed with pride, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she watched her granddaughter's nimble fingers dance through the air. As for Helen, her fate remained shrouded in uncertainty. We had extended an open invitation for her to come and live with us, to escape the constant harassment and isolation she had endured. But her stubbornness and pride had proven too strong, and she had steadfastly refused our offers, choosing instead to remain in her self-imposed exile. Part of me still felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of her suffering, alone and ostracized from the community she had once been a part of. But a larger part of me knew that this was the price she had to pay for her years of cruelty and selfishness. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up with her. As the months passed and the birth of our son drew nearer, Ryan and I made the decision to start fresh, a clean slate for our growing family. We packed up our belongings and said goodbye to the town that had been the epicenter of so much drama and heartache. On the day we left, I couldn't resist one final visit to Helen's house. Part of me hoped that she would have a change of heart, that she would see the error of her ways and come with us, seeking redemption and a chance to rebuild the relationships she had so carelessly destroyed. But as I approached her front door, a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The once well-kept yard was overgrown and unkempt, the windows shuttered and dark. It was clear that Helen had retreated even further into her self-imposed exile, cutting herself off from the world that had turned against her. With a heavy heart, I turned and walked away, leaving Helen to the consequences of her own actions. As I climbed into the car and looked back one last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure wash over me. This chapter of our lives was finally coming to an end, and a new, brighter one was just beginning. As we pulled away, the weight of Helen's influence lifted from our shoulders, like a heavy burden we had carried for far too long. In that moment, I made a silent vow to let go of the bitterness and resentment that had consumed us for so long, and to embrace the future with open arms. Our family had been through the fire, tempered and strengthened by the trials we had faced, and as we embarked on this new journey, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, united by the bonds of love and resilience that had carried us through the darkest of times. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The toxic grip of Helen's influence was finally broken, and we were free to forge our own destiny, unshackled by the weight of her cruelty and selfishness. It was a hard-won victory, but one that made the sweetness of our newfound freedom all the more savored. To my son Ethan and his wife Jolene on their 3rd anniversary. Patricia's wine glass glinted under the chandelier's warm glow as she raised it with a sickly sweet smile. May your union continue to be blessed. The dining room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of Patricia's barb, thinly veiled beneath a veil of faux congratulations. My stomach twisted, but I forced an awkward smile and raised my glass to my lips, swallowing a mouthful of the dry Cabernet. "Thank you, Mother," Ethan spoke up from beside me. To my dismay, he didn't seem to catch the underhanded meaning behind her toast. "We appreciate you hosting this lovely dinner." "Yes, it's been wonderful," I chimed in, more for appearance than anything. As an art teacher, I could barely afford to take Ethan out for our actual anniversary 2 nights ago, let alone attend some lavish family affair at his parents' riverside estate. Patricia's gaze remained fixed on me as the echoes of glass settled back onto the table's polished mahogany wood. "Jolene, dear, I must ask, is everything quite all right? You seem a bit tense." My cheeks flushed as I straightened in my chair. "Of course everything's fine, just enjoying the evening as any wife would." "I certainly hope so." Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Raising a family is such a rewarding experience. No woman's life is truly complete without it." The room fell still once more as her meaning sunk in like a stone. Ethan and I had been trying, unsuccessfully so far, to conceive our first child. But to have it brought up so publicly, veiled as an insult about my self-worth as a woman, it took every ounce of restraint not to cause a scene. "I think we've had enough wine for one evening," I said quickly, rising from my chair. I shot Ethan a pointed look. "Shall we be excused?" He seemed to sense my unease. "Ah, yes, you're probably right, dear. Thank you again for dinner, Mother." We made our excuses and departed for the car, making small talk as Ethan drove us home. But once inside our apartment, I could no longer contain my anger. "Did you really not catch what your mother was insinuating back there?" I rounded on him as he hung up his suit jacket. Ethan paused, sighing heavily. "Jolene, you know how she can be. Mother's always been a bit dramatic." "Dramatic?" I cried out in disbelief. "Ethan, she insulted me. Implied that I'm some sort of failure as a wife because we haven't been able to get pregnant yet, and you just sat there letting her words hang over me like a judgment." He held up his hands defensively. Okay. Maybe her choice of words wasn't the best, but you know how important raising a family is to her and my father. She's old-fashioned that way." I stared at him, dumbfounded by his willful ignorance of his mother's cruelty. Patricia's toxic behavior had become such a normalized part of our lives that Ethan couldn't even see it anymore. As I readied for bed, I made a decision. I wouldn't allow this manipulative woman's narcissistic schemes to control our lives any longer. If Ethan wasn't willing to stand up for me, for us, then I would have to do it myself, no matter what line I had to cross. In the weeks following Patricia's anniversary insult, her meddling only intensified. Ethan chalked it up to her good intentions, but I recognized the manipulation tactics for what they were. "Have you considered looking into fertility treatments?" she asked during one of her impromptu visits to our apartment. "At your age, you can't be too careful about these things." I bristled at her implication that I was somehow defective. "We're still exploring our options, Patricia, but I appreciate your concern." She waved a hand dismissively. "Options, schmotions, my gynecologist is the best in the state. I'll have his secretary pencil you in for a consultation." "That's really not necessary." "Nonsense, dear. What sort of mother would I be if I didn't ensure the future of this family's legacy?" Her eyes bored into me. "We simply cannot have a 3rd generation of—" She trailed off, letting the insult linger unspoken. I bit my tongue, fighting the urge to scream at this woman whose passive aggression knew no bounds. How Ethan failed to see the hurt she intentionally inflicted was beyond me. The next evening she arrived unannounced yet again, brushing past me into the living room with a basket laden with baby clothes and toys. I took the liberty of purchasing a few essentials, she chirped, unpacking the frilly outfits and plush animals one by one. Can't be too prepared for the little one, after all. Patricia, this is too much. I fought to keep my tone level as she presented each saccharine item in turn. What did you expect us to do, wait until you finally managed to get pregnant? She arched one perfectly plucked eyebrow. Lord knows how long that could take at this rate. The barb struck home, reopening the wound of her earlier slight about my womanhood. I opened my mouth, ready to unleash the torrent of anger boiling inside me, when Ethan appeared from the hallway, still in his work clothes. "Mother, what a lovely surprise," he greeted her with a tired smile. "Though you really didn't need to go to all this trouble." Patricia immediately switched gears, all sickly sweet smiles. "Nonsense, pumpkin. A grandmother has to take matters into her own hands sometimes." I watched in stunned silence as Ethan laughed lightly at her comment, bending to examine the frilly dresses and stuffed animals as if she'd committed no transgression. Later that night, as we readied for bed, I finally snapped. "Are you seriously okay with how she treats me?" With her invasive advice and insults thinly disguised as jokes? Ethan froze in his undressing, refusing to meet my eyes. "Jolene, you know my mother. She has a flair for the dramatic, yes, but she means well." "Means well?" I threw up my hands in exasperation. "Are you deluding yourself on purpose? Your mother is an insecure narcissist who takes cruel pleasure in needling away at me until I crack. That's enough." Ethan's voice took on an edge I rarely heard from him. "My mother is difficult, I'll give you that. But she's still my family, Jolene. I won't have you disrespecting her like that." I stared at him in disbelief, defending my abuser instead of validating the hurt I'd endured because of her. In that moment, I knew I couldn't rely on Ethan to see the light. If Patricia's reign of torment was going to end, I would have to bring everything crashing down myself. Patricia didn't let up in the following weeks. If anything, she grew bolder and more cutting with each unwelcome visit and condescending comment. The latest jab came at one of the dreaded Blackwood family gatherings, this one held at an upscale country club Ethan's father belonged to. As the dinner crowd settled in around the immense oak table, Patricia cleared her throat and raised her wine glass. "I'd like to start with a little toast," she proclaimed, that sickly smile plastered on her face. "To family and to new chapters on the horizon." My stomach clenched as all eyes turned toward me expectantly. This couldn't be another underhanded dig about my fertility, could it? "We've all been waiting so patiently," Patricia continued in that sugary sweet tone, "for the joyous news that the next generation will finally arrive to carry on our proud family name." I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold sense of dread creeping up my spine. She wouldn't dare? Not here? But alas, Patricia's expression soured into a dejected pout. "It seems some are simply unable to do their womanly duty and provide us with that happiness." The other relatives shifted awkwardly as the weight of her malice hung in the air. A few appalled gasps echoed from the far end of the table. "Mother, that's enough," Ethan warned, finally showing a flicker of backbone. But the damage had been done. Struggling against the torrent of shame and anger flooding my body, I pushed back from the table and stood, unable to even look at Ethan as he called my name. "Excuse me," I choked out, fighting back hot tears as I stormed away from the table. I had to get out of there before I caused a bigger scene than Patricia already had. The ornate country club bathroom provided a temporary sanctuary as I collapsed against the tile wall, thoughts swirling. How could she publicly humiliate me like that, over something so profoundly personal, so heartbreakingly painful for me? Ethan's half-hearted protests meant nothing. He'd done nothing to stop his mother's cruel behavior before. Why would he start now? For so long I'd endured Patricia's escalating belittlements and dismissals, her demeaning jokes and underhanded comments, all while Ethan seemed to view them as mere eccentricities, something to be indulged rather than condemned. But this was a step too far, an unforgivable violation that could never be walked back or rationalized away. By the time I collected myself enough to return to the dining area, most of the other guests had departed, leaving just Ethan and his parents lingering awkwardly. Patricia avoided meeting my gaze, feigning nonchalance as she drained her wine glass. "There you are, dear. she lilted with transparent insincerity. We were beginning to worry sick about... Enough, I spat, fury blazing in my chest. I've endured your contemptible behavior toward me for far too long, Patricia. But I'll be damned if I'll sit idly by while you publicly humiliate me like that again. Ethan tried to interject, but I silenced him with a raised hand. No, this ends now, one way or another. Consider this your last warning, Patricia. My voice dripped with venom as I turned on my heel and strode away, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan torn between calling after me or confronting his gobsmacked mother. As I peeled out of the parking lot, the wheels began turning in my mind. If she thought her little scene represented the depths of my humiliation, she had something else coming. It was time to take off the velvet gloves and fight fire with fire. There would be no more Mrs. Nice Jolene. The next afternoon, I met up with my best friend Rachel at a quiet cafe downtown. As I rehashed the humiliating scene from the country club, listing off each vindictive comment and backhanded insult from Patricia, Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. Jolene, I can't even find the words. She shook her head slowly. How does Ethan not see what a manipulative witch his mother is? I shrugged helplessly. At this point, I don't think he's capable of viewing her objectively. She's had him under her thumb for so long, disrespecting me is just normal behavior to overlook. Well, you can't just let her get away with that kind of cruelty, Rachel insisted, leaning forward. After how she humiliated you, you have to make a stand. Expose her for the toxic narcissist she really is. The idea struck a chord within me, stoking the flames of righteous indignation still smoldering from the previous night. Rachel was right. I could no longer sit idly by while Patricia's mental abuse escalated unchecked. Ethan's willful ignorance meant I couldn't rely on him to intervene. This was something I'd have to take on myself, no matter how drastic the measures. You're absolutely right, I said, conviction filling my voice. Patricia has had her way for far too long. It's time to stop being the bigger person and hit her where it really hurts, her oversized ego. Rachel arched an eyebrow. Oh, do tell, dear friend, what diabolical revenge scheme have you concocted already? The Blackwood Family Gala, I replied darkly. The biggest event of their social calendar happening next month. A who's who of Atlanta's elite, all gathered under one roof to gossip and flaunt their wealth. The perfect venue to air Patricia's dirty laundry for all to see, tarnishing her carefully curated appearance in front of everyone that mattered in her materialistic circles. Think you can get a hold of evidence? Rachel prodded. Conversations, documents, anything that could prove how disturbed she really is? A faint smile crossed my lips. Leave that to me. I know just where to start looking. Over the next few weeks, I began compiling an arsenal. Archived emails from Patricia containing underhanded criticisms of my family, my career, my ability to be a proper wife. Audio recordings from my phone capturing her condescending comments verbatim. I even managed to obtain a few pages from Patricia's private therapy notes, courtesy of a very disgruntled former employee at her doctor's office. The narcissistic observations, the blatant disdain for anyone outside her wealthy inner circle. It was all right there in black and white. With each new piece of irrefutable proof, my determination compounded. This wasn't just about getting payback against a cruel mother-in-law for years of emotional abuse. This was about dismantling her self-constructed pedestal, exposing the truth behind the immaculately maintained facade for all to see. I knew there would be consequences, that irrevocable bridges would be burned. But at this point, I simply didn't care anymore. Patricia's reign of toxic manipulation had gone on for far too long already. One way or another, I would be the one to finally bring her world crashing down around her. Over the next couple of weeks, I worked meticulously behind the scenes to gather allies and cultivate my plan for Patricia's downfall. It wasn't hard to find others who had been on the receiving end of her manipulative wrath over the years. My first co-conspirator was Ethan's cousin, Maya. At the latest Blackwood family gathering, I pulled her aside during the dinner reception. I take it Patricia hasn't been any kinder to you over the years? I asked without preamble. Maya's eyebrows shot up, but she quickly recovered with a humorless chuckle. The woman's cruelty knows no bounds. Why, just last Christmas she had the gall to disparage my body in front of the whole family. She leaned in with a conspiratorial smirk. Let's just say the molt hasn't been kind since giving birth. Say no more, I assured her. Look, I'm putting together let's call it a demonstration against Patricia's tyrannical reign, an eye-opening experience for the oblivious masses who enable her emotional abuse. Maya's expression turned intrigued, even hungry. Do tell, dear cousin-in-law, what did you have in mind? I laid out my scheme to leverage the upcoming Blackwood Gala to reveal Patricia's true colors, the undoctored truth behind her pristine facade of Southern gentility. To use her own insidious words and behaviors against her in a devastating public expose? By the time I finished, Maya's eyes were alight with devious glee. Consider me a willing accomplice in your master plot. She grinned wickedly. That miserable hag has it coming, and then some. Over the following days, Maya proved instrumental in helping me gather more damning evidence from disgruntled former employees and service staff. Turns out the generous tips Patricia bestowed carried plenty of strings and resentments attached. We even managed to enlist the sympathies of her own sister, Sarah, who had long borne the brunt of Patricia's ruthless favoritism. Just a few recordings of the two sisters' volatile arguments provided enough vitriol to make our case. My final ally, however, took some delicate persuasion to bring into the fold. During one of her tense visits to berate me, I finally took the opportunity to confront Ethan about his continual enabling of his mother's abuse. I cannot go on like this any longer, I stated bluntly after she had excused herself to powder her nose. Your mother's behavior has become completely unacceptable and intolerable. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet my gaze. Jolene, please, can we not revisit this again? Mother's just set in her ways, that's all. Set in her ways? I echoed in disbelief. Ethan, wake up. That woman is a toxic, manipulative narcissist who revels in making others miserable, me especially. If you refuse to put a stop to her cruelty once and for all, then I will. His eyes widened as I laid out the entire scheme, the evidence, the co-conspirators, the plan to decimate Patricia's immaculate reputation in one fell swoop at the gala. For a long while he simply stared, seemingly in stunned silence. Then, slowly, resignation crept across his features. A weariness settled into his eyes as he seemed to truly see the damage his mother had wrought, not just to me, but to their entire family. Do. Whatever you feel you must, he said at last, exhaustion seeping into his tone. I think I've enabled her for far too long already. With Ethan's reluctant capitulation, the game was set. We had everything required to bring Patricia's reign of terror to a decisive, humiliating conclusion on the biggest stage imaginable. All that remained was to see our master plan through to its ruthless finale. The night of the annual Blackwood family gala arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Well, for me and my co-conspirators at least. Patricia and her oblivious entourage of sycophants were completely unsuspecting. We arrived fashionably late to the opulent country club ballroom, Patricia preening as she worked the room. Her public persona was in full force, every hair perfectly coiffed, every pearl and stitch of designer couture immaculate as she greeted Atlanta's elite with syrupy platitudes. I had to fight to keep the sneer off my face watching her performance. But soon, very soon, that genteel facade would come crashing down in spectacular fashion. Good evening, Mother, Ethan greeted stiffly as we approached. You've certainly outdone yourself this year. Why, thank you, darling. Patricia oozed magnanimity, grasping his hand. I simply had to ensure tonight was an occasion to remember for us all. Her eyes bored into me as she added with an insincere smile, for the good of the family, of course. I refused to take her baited response, merely nodding curtly. It's certainly an opulent affair. Shall we take our seats, then? Ethan interjected before Patricia could fire another loaded barb. I believe the program is about to commence. We filtered into the cavernous ballroom, taking our places at the extended family's table near the front. All around us, Atlanta's wealthiest elite mingled and air-kissed, sipping champagne and evaluating each other's designer frocks with judgmental eyes. Patricia certainly knew how to cater to their vapid vanity. As the halting speeches from various dignitaries droned on, I caught Maya's eye across the table. She subtly patted the clutch in her lap, the signal that the evidence was ready and waiting for its grand unveiling. On my other side, Sarah sipped her wine casually, masking her own eager anticipation. She'd been waiting a lifetime to stick it to her cruel younger sister. Finally, the excruciating parade of long-winded tributes concluded, and the gala hostess took the stage to turn over the mic to Patricia for her traditional closing remarks. "What a resplendent evening we've had, hasn't it?" she began in her oozingly aristocratic drawl. "Truly, I'm humbled to see so many of our community's finest joining us in celebration of family, legacy, and the refined bloodlines that shape—" The first thunderclap of transgression cut through Patricia's fatuous words like a gunshot. In an instant, the ballmom's eyes blew wide as her own recorded voice filled the hushed ballroom. "That ungrateful freeloader needs to get off her ass for once and earn her keep around here," the recording snarled with dripping condescension. "Mark my words, if she can't get pregnant soon, she's out on the street. No daughter-in-law of mine." Another recording blared just as suddenly, this one capturing a verbal assault on poor Maya in all its ugliness. "Look at you, you repulsive disgrace. Your thighs are more waddling than your hips these days. Why, I'd nearly mistake you for one of Shamu's calves if the smell wasn't so revolting." With each successive audio clip, more of Patricia's unvarnished malice filled the ballroom. Her contorted features shifted rapidly between disbelief, rage, and panic as every bigoted insult, every gaslighting manipulation was laid bare for all to hear. The elite masses she put so much stock in watching reacted with a mixture of shock, revulsion, and grotesque fascination. Exactly as I'd anticipated. Elite society thrived on cruel voyeurism. So transfixed were the onlookers that my clandestine projector setup across the ballroom went completely unnoticed until it was too late. With a few taps on my tablet, I activated the overhead screens, displaying the most damning excerpts from Patricia's therapy sessions for all to see. By the time her hate-filled words about minorities and the poor stretched across 10-foot text, Patricia was apoplectic. Her rage twisted her face into something vile and inhuman, the perfect embodiment of the soulless monster she'd striven to conceal. "No! No! How dare you!" The shriek clawed its way from her throat as she finally realized the full extent of my orchestration. You treacherous little—" But her venomous diatribe went unfinished as Sarah finally abandoned all pretense and hurled the remaining contents of her wineglass directly into Patricia's face. "That's for a lifetime of misery, you hateful cow." In an instant, the once refined gala descended into pandemonium. Revelations sparked furious confrontations. Humiliated society elites turned on one another as scandals erupted on all sides. Fistfights and broken champagne flutes exploded amidst the hysteria. And there, silhouette against the maelstrom, stood the crumbling remains of one Patricia Blackwood, disgraced, discarded, and utterly defeated. As the riotous scene unfolded, I simply watched in cold satisfaction, knowing I had well and truly slain the beast. My revenge was finally complete. The days following the gala explosion were a whirlwind of backlash and bitter confrontations. The fallout from my exposé decimated the Blackwood family's sterling reputation across Atlanta's upper crust. For once, the masses Patricia had put on a pedestal got to witness her true, unfiltered venom firsthand. Furious donors withdrew funding from the various charities and organizations the Blackwoods generously and publicly patronized. Country club memberships were swiftly revoked. The family's impeccably maintained social facade lay in irreparable ruins. Throughout it all, Patricia remained unrepentant, lashing out at anyone in proximity. Wild-eyed rants spewed from her withering lips, labeling me an ungrateful, vapid peasant, intent on destroying her family's legacy. Ethan attempted to play peacemaker, but it was impossible to douse the raging inferno I'd sparked. The truth of his mother's depravity had incinerated any remaining delusions about her character. "How could you do this, Jolene?" he demanded one evening, voice ragged from the endless screaming matches. "You've brought shame and ruin on us all." I simply shook my head in cold disgust. "Don't act so bloody shocked. That vile woman's actions were indefensible, as your own silence constantly demonstrated." Ethan recoiled as if struck, suddenly aware of how obtusely he'd enabled Patricia's emotional torture all these years, how he'd willfully turned a blind eye to my anguish in a misguided bid to preserve his perfect family's image. I never intended." His words trailed off into wearied resignation. The light of realization battled in his eyes. but I refused to grant him any absolution yet. I'd suffered far too long for such easy contrition. As the Blackwoods descended into squabbling over the smoldering remains of their family legacy, I stood firm on the outskirts. Their entire sordid legacy stemmed from one truth: unchecked narcissism, fueled by wealth and enabled by obedient silence. Even now, Ethan's father Randall attempted to bully his way into regaining control, lobbing threats of retribution laced with noxious bigotry. The poison tree merely producing its rotten fruit, but they could threaten and bluster all they wanted. Thanks to the irrevocable proof of their true natures displayed before Atlanta's elite, the Blackwoods were now utterly discredited. Contemptible social outcasts, left to wallow in infamy and face the consequences of their abusive supremacy. Only when the fires finally died down a few weeks later, when Randall and Patricia had retreated in disgrace from public view, only then did the enormity of my actions finally sink in. My triumph had come at an incalculable personal price. The towering walls of glass and steel that insulated the Blackwoods' dynastic opulence from Atlanta's unworthy masses were shattered beyond repair. And in the aftermath, every sordid detail of our private turmoil had been laid pitilessly bare. I expected Ethan to lash out anew, to decry my willingness to dismantle his vaulted family legacy in the name of vengeance, to accuse me of going too far in my bid to discredit his manipulative matriarch. What I didn't expect was the resignation in his eyes when he finally emerged from the wreckage to face me. The tacit acknowledgement of how completely he had failed me over the years. How thoroughly Patricia's insidious influence had poisoned our once vibrant union. There would be no easy path forward for us. Too much pain remained, too many open wounds left seeping from the detonation of my merciless retaliation. But for the first time in longer than I could recall, I saw the unflinching truth reflected in Ethan's gaze. Sometimes the only way to cauterize an infection is to burn it out completely. The weeks following my explosive gala takedown were a bitter whirlwind. The Blackwood family was in utter disarray, their narcissistic empire of influence in tatters. Through it all, Ethan and I kept our distance, speaking in terse sentences when absolutely necessary. The chasm between us gaped wide, rendered impassable by the devastation of my vengeful actions. A part of me wondered if we'd ever manage to salvage anything from the scorched earth I'd created. But I steadfastly refused to allow any lingering doubt or remorse to fester. Patricia's cruelty had gone unanswered for far too long. She and her enablers deserved to reap the karma they'd so ruthlessly sown. Then, one quiet evening as dusk settled over the city, a terse knock sounded at my apartment door. I frowned, setting aside my half-graded stack of student artworks to answer it. Ethan stood in the hallway, hands jammed in his pockets, expression a mask of weary resignation. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Do we?" I arched an eyebrow. I was under the impression there was nothing left to discuss after what Please. The word emerged hoarse and strained. "Just give me a chance, Jolene. One last chance before—" He trailed off helplessly. Despite my lingering bitterness, that haunted look in his eyes gave me pause. Reluctantly, I stepped back to allow him inside. For a long while, we sat in uneasy silence, the weight of months of pent-up grievances and unspoken accusations hanging heavy between us. I found myself studying Ethan anew, searching for any hint of the man I'd fallen in love with before his poisonous family slowly crushed his spirit. When he finally spoke, the words emerged as a tortured rasp. "I don't know where to even begin. What you did, the lies you exposed, the willful cruelty." He shook his head slowly, amazed that even now the full extent of his mother's malice proved so stunning. "Your mother was an insecure, narcissistic tyrant," I said bluntly. "A miserable, toxic woman who took sick pleasure in destroying anyone who dared defy her twisted worldview." Ethan's flinch was visceral, as if reliving one of Patricia's verbal lashings all over again. But I showed no remorse. He needed to confront this harsh truth head-on. "And worst of all," I drove the point home further, "you were too weak to ever stand up to her manipulations, even when I begged you to intervene. Her brainwashing rendered you utterly impotent." The accusations hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. Rather than lash out in denial or defensiveness, Ethan merely nodded in weary acknowledgement. "You're right. I allowed my family's toxic dynamics to fester for far too long. To control me, shape my reality until I was just numb to the abuse hurled at you, at everyone around us. He lifted his gaze to meet mine, naked remorse burning in his eyes. I failed you, plain and simple, as a partner, as the man who vowed to love and protect you above all else. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw the struggle for redemption warring within him. It wasn't enough to simply capitulate after the fact. He had to actively fight to dismantle the insidious conditioning Patricia had inflicted. Only then could we endeavor to salvage the tattered remnants of our relationship and rebuild from the rubble. It won't be easy, I stated, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. That woman's venom has been allowed to infect us for far too long. But if you're truly willing to fight for us, to reject her narcissistic reign once and for all. A flicker of hope gleamed in Ethan's eyes, reinvigorated determination burning behind it. Then you'd better be prepared to run beside me every step of the way. His answering nod was resolute, the old ghosts of hesitation and weakness exorcised by the raging fires of truth. It was a start. The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. Clarissa's words hung in the air like a bad smell. I've decided to sell my house and move in with you all. It will be such a blessing to have the family under one roof again. My mother-in-law smiled that sickly sweet smile she always used when getting her way. Beckett sat frozen beside me, his brow furrowed. Finn stared down at his half-eaten meatloaf, mercifully oblivious to the bombshell Clarissa had just dropped. That's quite a decision, Mother, Beckett finally managed. Don't you think you should have discussed it with us first? Clarissa waved a ringed hand. Oh, I didn't want to burden you both with it until I'd made up my mind. This way it's settled. No need for any fusses. My heart pounded as her real message sank in. She would be immovable on this, as she always was. Steam-rolling her way into our lives, consequences be damned. I appreciate your, consideration, I said carefully. But Beckett and I will need to discuss what that would look like for our family. There are a lot of factors to work through. Clarissa fixed me with a pointed look. Like what, dear? I'll have my own space, so no inconvenience on your end. I simply want to be closer to my grandchild and spend my twilight years surrounded by loved ones. Surely you can't object to that? The subtle condescension dripped from her tone. The implication that I would deprive her of family, of Finn, if I objected. Classic manipulation. Mom, Beckett ran a hand over his face. We can't make this decision right now at the dinner table. Well, I don't see why not, Clarissa said airily. I think we'd all sleep better with this settled, don't you? She turned to Finn, her eyes going misty. You'd love having your dear old grandma around every day, wouldn't you, sweetheart? Finn looked up, puzzled. Sure, I guess. There, you see, the matter is decided. She beamed at me triumphantly. My stomach twisted. I knew the reality. There would be no peaceful twilight years. This was about control, plain and simple. The start of her ultimate power play to run this household her way. I opened my mouth, ready to protest, to shut this down before it began. But Beckett's pained expression stopped me. He already looked so conflicted, so troubled by having to buck his beloved mother's wishes. So instead, I simply forced a smile and said, We'll discuss it tonight after dinner, dear. The first battle was lost, but the war was only just beginning. Clarissa wasted no time making her presence felt. The very next morning, she was in the kitchen bright and early, tutting at the mess. You really should start your day earlier, Juniper dear. A properly kept home is the hallmark of a good wife and mother. I grit my teeth, biting back the retort on my tongue as Finn wandered in, still bleary-eyed. Clarissa immediately zoned in on his unkempt hair and rumpled t-shirt. Good heavens, does that boy ever look presentable? She aimed a disapproving look my way. You'd think his mother would take a bit more pride. I'm proud of Finn just the way he is, I said tightly. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to start breakfast. Her lips pursed, but Clarissa merely nodded and stepped aside to make way for me. For now. Over the next few weeks, her comments became a constant needling drone, nitpicking my cooking, my housekeeping, my parenting, always with that same sugary sweet smile plastered on her face. That's not how I used to make the meatloaf, dear. Let me show you the proper way. Did you not notice that stain on the sofa? Housekeeping was so much easier when the children were younger. Speaking of children, you simply must put your foot down with Finn's attitude. He's headed down a troubled path without strict discipline. The worst came at Finn's school arts exhibition. He had worked so hard on his painting series, prezipping quietly in his room for weeks. I was bursting with pride as we circulated the gallery, admiring his vibrant, expressive work. Until Clarissa's shrill voice cut through the crowd. Well, I must say I'm quite underwhelmed by this juvenile scribbling. Constant doodling is no path to success. Finn's face drained of color. I watched his shoulders hunch, his eyes drop to the floor as snickers rippled through the event hall. "Mother," Beckett hissed. "What is wrong with you?" Clarissa blinked innocently. "What, I'm simply stating facts. Hard critique is the only way he'll improve." "That's enough." I cut her off, rage bubbling up within me. "You will not humiliate my son like that, do you understand?" For a moment, Clarissa actually looked taken aback. Then her mouth set in a hard line, and she fixed me with an icy look. "Your son, is it? We'll see about that." With that parting shot, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving me to deal with the fallout of her callous outburst. As Finn struggled not to cry and the other parents looked on with thinly veiled judgment, I saw only red. Something had to be done, before Clarissa destroyed everything I held dear. The air was thick with tension when we got home that night. Beckett paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. "I can't believe she did that," he muttered for the 10th time. "So cruel and uncalled for." "This is exactly why I didn't want her moving in." The words burst from me in a torrent. "She has no boundaries, no filter, and she'll keep lashing out and humiliating us until she gets her way about everything." Beckett's head whipped around, his eyes flashing. "Don't talk about my mother that way." I gaped at him. "After what she did to Finn, you're taking her side?" "Of course not." He sank onto the couch, cradling his head. "But she's still my mother. We can't just kick her out on the street." "Even though she's making our lives miserable?" He looked up at me imploringly. "She'll get better, June. Once she's settled in, I'm sure this behavior will stop. We just have to set some clear boundaries." I barked out a harsh laugh. "Boundaries? Have you met your mother? She doesn't respect any boundaries except her own." Beckett flinched at my tone, and I instantly regretted my harsh words. This wasn't his fault, I knew that. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice softening. "You're right, we can't just kick her out, but we also can't just ignore how toxic she's being." He opened his mouth to respond, but a loud clatter from the hallway cut him off. Stomping footsteps, then the icy tones of my mother-in-law. "Well, I certainly hope you're proud of yourselves, squabbling over me like selfish children." Clarissa swept into the room, her face thunderous. In her hand was a ceramic figure from the mantelpiece, one that had been in Beckett's family for generations. "Your petty arguing must have knocked this priceless heirloom to the floor. An object like this belongs in a museum, not in the home of such careless ingrates." My mouth dropped open. I clearly remembered dusting the mantel that morning. The figurine had been securely in place. Beckett jumped to his feet. "Mom, that's not what happened at all. You're overreacting." "Am I?" She rounded on me, eyes blazing. "Well then, Juniper, please do tell us what careless act toppled this precious artifact. I'm all ears." I opened and closed my mouth at a total loss, because I knew, deep down, that her accusation was patently false. Clarissa's thin lips curled into a smile of pure vindication. "That's what I thought. Really, Beckett, I don't know how you can allow such a thoughtless, messy woman to raise your child." I saw red. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward and slapped the vile woman straight across that smug face. Clarissa's head whipped to the side, her hand flying to her reddened cheek. She stared at me in utter shock. "Get out," I hissed through gritted teeth, "before I do something worse." "Juniper," Beckett's voice cracked like a whip. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The utter betrayal in his eyes sliced into my heart. In that moment, it was like the man I loved was a total stranger. While Clarissa worked to regain her composure, I took a shaky breath and held Beckett's gaze. "I'm done being your mother's punching bag," I said, my voice low. "Either you put a stop to this, or you'll have to choose between us." Heavy silence fell over the room. Clarissa was watching avidly, her lips curved into that same sickly smile I'd come to despise. Beckett's face was utterly inscrutable. I didn't wait for his answer. I simply turned and left the room, chest heaving. The war had been declared. There would be no more playing nice. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Beckett and I moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding each other in an uneasy truce. Clarissa, smug as ever, acted like nothing had happened. "Pleasant morning, isn't it?" she'd chirp as I grabbed my coffee and rushed out the door to work. Beckett wouldn't even meet my gaze. It couldn't go on like this. Either we dealt with Clarissa head-on, or our family would be torn apart. But I needed ammunition, a way to prove to Beckett just how vindictive and manipulative his mother truly was. That proof came from an unlikely source, Mrs. Pennington from next door. I was trimming the hedges when she popped her head over the fence. "Everything okay, dear? You look simply haunted." I paused, struggling with how much to reveal. Before I could stop myself, it all came pouring out. Clarissa's cruelty, the wedge she was driving between Beckett and me, her deranged lies. Mrs. Pennington listened intently, clucking her tongue. I knew that woman was trouble from the moment she moved in. Mark my words, she's poison. My eyes widened. "You've dealt with her before?" "In our neighborhood social club, she caused no end of dramatics." Mrs. Pennington's eyes narrowed. "Kicked up an unholy fuss until she got her way about every little thing. Turned everyone against each other with her malicious gossip and lies. Why, by the time she left, the club was in utter shambles." I recognized the twisted genius of Clarissa's tactics all too clearly. Divide and conquer through relentless manipulation. "If you've got recordings of her outrageous behavior, I'd be happy to corroborate your story," Mrs. Pennington added. My mind began whirling with the possibilities. I needed to gather evidence, proof that Clarissa's sugary words hid razor-sharp malice. That night, I dug out my old voice recorder and installed it in the living room, hitting record before the three of us sat down for an evening chat. "My, what lovely curtains," Clarissa gushed as soon as we got settled. "Though I do think the salmon shades would be more complimentary in this space." I tensed, ready for her to let the insults fly about my decorating skills, but she simply smiled placidly and took a long sip of tea. The jibes started small at first. Judgmental little quips about my cooking, my outfit, my rebellious views on parenting as compared to her traditionalist ways. Then, right on cue, Clarissa turned her focus onto Beckett. "Really, dear, I'm a bit worried about this new project of yours at work. It all sounds so very risky. Perhaps you should have consulted me before pitching it to your bosses." "Thanks for the concern, Mom," Beckett replied through gritted teeth, "but I've got it handled." Clarissa tutted softly. "Yes, well, we'll see, won't we? I simply worry you've bitten off more than you can chew. Juniper's influence doesn't exactly inspire confidence, if you know what I mean." You could have heard a pin drop. I glanced sidelong at Beckett, whose face was mottled red with barely contained rage. "That's enough, Mother," he warned in a low growl. But Clarissa merely shrugged, a sly smile playing about her lips. "I'm only speaking the truth, dear." Hours of recordings like these followed over the next few weeks, each one making my heart pound harder, my anger towards this vile woman growing. By the time I gathered the evidence and Mrs. Pennington's testimony, I was ready to unleash the full force of Clarissa's own depraved behavior right back at her. No more playing games. This ended now. I waited until Beckett was out running errands with Finn before calling Clarissa into the living room. She glided in, taking a seat with her usual breezy arrogance. "What can I do for you, dear? Finally ready to accept my advice on redecorating this drab space?" I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. "Cut the act, Clarissa. I'm done playing games." Her eyes narrowed, but the smirk didn't leave her lips. "Whatever do you mean?" Instead of answering, I simply pressed play on the voice recorder. Her own shrill tones filled the room, spitting vicious remarks about Beckett's incompetence, insults about my failings as a wife and mother, nasty gossip designed to turn us against each other. Clarissa's face remained impassive as the recordings played, but I could see the muscle twitching in her jaw. When the litany of cruelty finally ended, she gave a simpering shrug. "So I've made a few offhanded comments here and there. I was only trying to help guide you, make suggestions for your family's well-being." "Don't insult my intelligence," I snapped. "These were calculated attacks, meant to undermine me and drive a wedge between Beckett and me. Your little dominance games." Those beady eyes glinted with something like respect. "Very perceptive of you, Juniper, though I'd have thought my motivations would be obvious from the start." I surged to my feet, fists clenched at my sides. Why, Clarissa? Why are you so hell-bent on destroying my family? She rose as well, lips curling into an oily smile. Because this was never about your family, you silly girl. It's about power, ensuring I have final say over everything in my twilight years. And you were the only one standing in my way. A chill ran down my spine, but I held her gaze steadily. Well, your little gambit stops right now. I'm done letting you manipulate and debase us. Oh? One sculpted eyebrow arched delicately. And just what are your terms for that, pray tell? I took a step closer, my voice low and menacing. You're going to leave. Get out of our lives and never contact us again. In return, I'll give you enough money to pay off your little debt problem, shall we say? Clarissa's mask slipped for just an instant, shock flitting across her features before the stony disdain returned. I allowed myself a grim smile. It seemed my snooping had paid off. Well, you've certainly been a busy little thing, haven't you? Her lip curled. Though I have to wonder what my darling son will think about your strong-arming tactics. He'll think whatever he wants, I said coolly. But he'll have proof of exactly the kind of manipulative snake you are first. Our eyes bored into each other, a silent battle of wills stretching between us. Finally, Clarissa gave a stiff nod. Very well, you've made your point. I accept your generous offer, but be warned, the day will come when you regret pushing me away for good. The threat could have chilled my blood, but all I felt in that moment was an immense sense of relief. At long last, this nightmare would be over. My hands were shaking as I laid out the place settings for our monthly family dinner. Clarissa sat primly on the couch, shooting me disdainful looks every few minutes. She hadn't taken my ultimatum well, that was for sure. The doorbell rang, announcing Beckett and Finn's arrival. Showtime. Hello, my dears. Clarissa was all sugary sweetness as they walked in, air kissing their cheeks. I'm simply famished, aren't you? Beckett eyed her warily but said nothing as we all took our seats around the dining table. An uneasy silence fell, only the clinking of utensils on china plates to fill it. Finn squirmed in his seat, looking from me to his grandmother with narrowed eyes. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Okay, what's the deal? He blurted out. You two have been acting super weird for weeks. I took a deep, steadying breath as all eyes swung towards me. Here went nothing. You're right, Finn, and it's time the truth finally came out. Clarissa snorted delicately. I beg your pardon? What bizarre melodrama is this now? Ignoring her, I produced the thick manila envelope I'd compiled, sliding it across the table towards Beckett. In that envelope is proof of who your mother really is, I said, keeping my voice carefully level. The manipulation, the cruelty, the pathological need to destroy us from the inside. Juniper, Clarissa gasped in overblown outrage. How dare you? But I cut her off with a sharp look. Don't bother denying it. I have hours of recordings, transcripts, testimonies, everything documenting your deranged vendetta against me and this family. Beckett said nothing, staring down at the innocuous manila envelope like a snake about to strike. Finn shifted closer, craning his neck for a better view. When Clarissa spoke again, her syrupy tone had vanished, leaving only an icy rasp. So you wish to slander and defame me? Very well, get it over with then. With trembling fingers, Beckett opened the envelope and began rifling through the papers inside. His brow furrowed deeper with every transcript, every damning piece of evidence. This can't be, he mumbled, shaking his head slowly. It's all true, I said, quiet but firm. Every vicious word out of her mouth, caught on tape. I clicked the voice recorder, letting Clarissa's shrill diatribes fill the air once more. Useless, ungrateful child. Of course he can't handle that deal without my input. No wonder Juniper is such a dismal failure at parenting. It's a miracle the boy isn't a delinquent yet. Perhaps I should take over the family finances before that silly girl drives us into the poorhouse. At last, I stopped the playback, letting the weight of proof speak for itself. Clarissa's face was mottled purple, a twisting sneer of pure loathing fixed on me. But I didn't flinch, didn't look away. The silence stretched out agonizingly until finally, Beckett looked up at his mother. There were tears in his eyes. Mom, how could you? His voice broke on the last word. Clarissa actually laughed then, a harsh, barking sound. Don't play the wounded innocent with me. I was simply doing what was necessary to protect this family from ruin. By sabotaging us every chance you got? I couldn't stop myself from interjecting. By turning everyone against each other? That's what was necessary? Of course it was. Clarissa was on her feet now, shoulders heaving with rage. I could see quite clearly how incompetent you both are. Beckett's career hanging by a thread, this house falling to ruin, poor Finn turned into a sullen delinquent under your lax, idiotic parenting. She whirled on Finn then, fixing him with a stare that could freeze lava. Just look at the way you present yourself. Sloppy? No ambition. Do you really want to end up a failure like your so-called parents? Don't talk about my parents like that. The retort was shouted with such raw fury, such rebellious vehemence, that we all fell silent in shock. Finn was on his feet too now, fists clenched and shaking at his sides as he faced down his grandmother with bravery I could scarcely believe. Mom and Dad have been nothing but supportive and loving. You're the failure, Grandma, and after everything I just heard, I want you out of our lives for good. Clarissa looked as though she'd been slapped. That was my son, showing the same fierce determination I felt in my bones to protect our little family, no matter what. With a cry of pure outrage, Clarissa swept from the room, nearly taking the front door off its hinges as she left. For a long moment, the three of us simply stared at each other in stunned silence. Then Beckett crossed the room in 2 long strides and crushed me in a desperate embrace. "I'm so sorry," he rasped against my neck. "I'm so sorry." We held each other for a long time after that, our family battered and bruised but still standing strong against anything the cruel world could throw at us. And for the first time in years I could breathe freely once more. The silence that followed Clarissa's dramatic exit was deafening. Beckett and I simply held each other, letting the roaring in our ears gradually subside. Finn hovered nearby, looking shaken. At last, Beckett pulled back, cradling my face in his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears. "June, I don't know what to say. How could I have been so blind?" I covered his hands with my own, giving them a reassuring squeeze. "She's a master manipulator, Bex. She knows exactly what strings to pull." He shook his head slowly. "But you tried to warn me, over and over, and I just dismissed you, took her side every time." A muscle ticked in his jaw as his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "Some husband and father I turned out to be." "Hey," I pecked him gently on the lips. "We can't change the past, but we did what was needed to protect our family. That's what matters." "She's right, Dad." Finn stepped forward, his usually sullen expression giving way to something solemn and resolved. "You guys fought for us, for our family unit. That's what real parents do. They put their kids first, no matter what sick crap gets thrown at them." He looked down, scuffing at the hardwood with his sneaker toe. I'm sorry, I haven't really appreciated that, or noticed how much you've both sacrificed while that evil witch was making all your lives hell." Beckett pulled Finn into a fierce hug, holding him tightly. I felt the moisture prick at my own eyes watching them, my 2 favorite people, survivors of the worst betrayal. "No more apologies," Beckett said gruffly. "We're a team again now, the 3 of us. Anything else, we handle it together. United front." Finn nodded wordlessly against his father's shoulder. When they finally separated, all traces of the moody teenager had left his face. He looked solemnly determined. "So, what's the plan? Do we go to the cops, file a report about her?" I shook my head. As satisfying as that sounds, it's not worth dragging this ugliness out any further. She's gone from our lives now. Best to let her disappear for good. Beckett nodded in agreement. "There is one last loose end to tie up, though." He withdrew a check from his shirt pocket, holding it out to me with a rueful smile. "Your settlement fee for getting rid of dear old Mom. Seems like you've got a real head for this revenge scheme stuff." I rolled my eyes, but couldn't stop the grin from spreading across my face as I took the check. "Please, it was a piece of cake compared to the drama of getting you 2 geniuses to do your homework every night." Finn snorted, some of his old teenage snark returning. I relished the sound, so familiar and comforting after the nightmare we'd endured. Later that evening, I made the inevitable call to Clarissa. She answered on the 3rd ring, her tone as cutting as I expected. "Well, you've had your fun, exposed me as a villain for the storybooks. Are you quite satisfied?" I nearly bit my tongue, forcibly restraining the caustic retort. No more vicious back and forths. It was time to break this cycle forever. I'm wiring you the money to cover your debts and get back on your feet, Clarissa. Use it well, live your life however you want from now on. I paused, taking a deep breath. Just never contact us again, or there will be consequences. For a moment I thought she might try to argue, to manipulate her way back into our lives as she'd always done. But finally she gave a stiff nod. Very well. This chapter of our lives is over, it seems. Though I shudder to think of the dysfunction you'll raise my great-grandchildren in. The barb hit its mark, as did her parting laughter at my stunned silence. But instead of anger, I felt only pity for the miserable, petty woman. As I hung up the phone, I knew our family was truly free of her twisted games forever. Over the next few weeks and months, Beckett, Finn, and I went to therapy, both together and individually. We processed the emotional wounds Clarissa had inflicted, made a plan to rebuild our bonds of trust and open communication. It wasn't easy, not by any stretch. There were setbacks, conflicts that reopened old scars, but we persevered, drawing strength from each other. Slowly, steadily, the darkness lifted. Beckett and I rediscovered the passionate love that first drew us together. Finn's perpetual sulk faded as he opened up about his hurt and insecurities. We became an invincible unit once more. And as for me, I felt a profound sense of catharsis and triumph. I had been forced to fight for my family's very existence, and I'd won. No, we'd won. Because there was no victory without the three of us. Boldly staring down malice and emerging with our humanity, our unbreakable core, intact, that knowledge made every hardship worth it. My life's purpose achieved. The moving truck rumbled up Clarissa's driveway, an oversized metal beast hungrily awaiting its cargo. I watched from the sidelines, arms folded across my chest. Well, isn't this a heartwarming family farewell? Clarissa swept out of the front door, as elegantly poised as ever despite the circumstances. She zeroed in on me immediately, those hawk-like eyes glinting with residual malice. I must say, Juniper, I'm almost impressed. Scheming to kick your own mother-in-law out on the street. It's delightfully cutthroat of you. My jaw clenched, but I held my tongue. No more rising to her barbed taunts, ever again. Beckett emerged from the house then, Finn trailing behind with a sullen expression. He strode over to me, slipping a protective arm around my waist. That's enough, Mother. We had a deal. You take the money and resettle elsewhere. No more drama. Clarissa's thin lips compressed into a tight line, but she gave a stiff nod. Yes, of course. A deal is a deal, after all. Her gaze flicked towards Finn, who was determinedly avoiding her eyes. Though I do hope you'll allow me one last word with my grandson before I'm so tragically banished. The derisive sarcasm in her tone made my skin crawl, but Beckett simply shrugged. That's up to Finn. We're not going to force him. An uncomfortable silence fell. I could see the wheels turning in Clarissa's mind as she considered whether or not to push the issue. Thankfully, Finn made the choice for her. I don't have anything to say, he mumbled, finally meeting her stare with undisguised contempt. Not after everything you put this family through. For a fraction of a second, Clarissa's mask slipped, revealing the unholy rage boiling underneath. Then, just as quickly, the cool disdain returned. Very well. Can't say I'm surprised at such petulant disrespect given your subpar upbringing. One final jab before sweeping past us towards the idling moving truck. As the movers began efficiently loading up the last remnants of Clarissa's presence in our lives, Beckett turned to me with a small, sad smile. I know this was extreme, but you did what needed to be done for all of us. Thank you. I laced my fingers through his, giving his hand a soft squeeze. We're family, I said simply. Till the end. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that. Old wounds ran deep, and there was bound to be more emotional fallout from Clarissa's torment to confront. But at least now it would be just the three of us, shoulder to shoulder. No malignant outside force driving us apart. Over the coming weeks and months, we slowly but surely put the painful pieces back together. Beckett and I attended joint counseling, relearning to openly communicate without fear of undermining from Clarissa. Finn started seeing a therapist, too, to work through the damage of having such a toxic influence in his life from an early age. There were setbacks, absolutely. Clarissa's cruel words would slither unbidden into my mind at random moments, filling me with impotent anger and hurt. Beckett admitted to still struggling with guilt over being so blind to her true nature for so long. And Finn? Well, he was a typical teenager, after all. His old sullen habits would creep back in without warning. But we took each challenge as it came, as a team. With Clarissa finally out of our lives for good, we were free to heal and reconnect on our own terms. The day I knew we'd truly put the past behind us came unexpectedly. One crisp autumn evening at the dinner table. There was no special occasion, nothing to mark the moment as significant. Beckett and I chatted about mundane things, work, errands, the new movie we wanted to see over the weekend. Finn sat across from us, chewing thoughtfully as he listened. Then, out of nowhere, he set down his fork and looked up at me with those same serious eyes that had first showed his backbone against Clarissa's manipulation. You know, I get it now. Why you fought so hard to get rid of Grandma. I paused, startled, sharing a glance with Beckett. We'd thought that painful chapter of our lives firmly closed. Finn scratched at the back of his neck, suddenly bashful. I mean, I always knew she was bad news in a general way, but seeing how far you went to protect us, risking everything, not just thinking of yourself. He shook his head slowly. That's what real parents do, you know? They'd go through anything for their kids, no matter what. My vision blurred with grateful tears as I reached across the table to grip Finn's hand. You've got that right, kiddo. No matter what. In that moment, I felt something profound shift inside me. The last lingering tendrils of anger and hurt over Clarissa's cruelty simply evaporated. Whatever resentment or bitterness had been weighing me down for so long just dispersed into the ether. As I looked around at my little family, my heart swelled with love. This was everything, the core truth that had kept me fighting through our darkest days. Beckett and Finn were my world, and I would walk through fire 1,000 times to keep them safe and happy. The past was just that, past. We had survived the worst betrayal and come out battered, but bonded and stronger than ever before. A new chapter was unfolding for us, one of healing and rediscovered joy. And this time I thought with a serene smile there would be no outside forces to disrupt our hard-earned peace. Just us, forging our own path forward as a united, radiant family. You think you can trust family to have your back, but what happens when they're the ones holding the knife? Those words rang hollow in my mind as I stared numbly at the incriminating photos strewn across my desk. Pictures of my younger sister Alina and my boyfriend Jamie, intimate moments captured that shattered my world into pieces. How could you do this to me? I asked hoarsely, tears streaming down my cheeks as Jamie shifted uncomfortably in front of me. Alina simply smirked. Did you really think he could ever be fully satisfied with someone as dull and boring as you, sis? Jamie deserves excitement in his life, something you've never been able to provide. The venom in her words stung, made worse by Jamie's refusal to meet my eyes. My creative passion as a graphic designer used to energize him, or so I thought. But Alina's magnetic charm had clearly seduced him. I was 28 years old, established in my career, and thinking I had the perfect life in our big city. Meanwhile, Alina at 24 had always seethed with jealousy at my accomplishments, masking it behind a dazzling smile. This has to stop right now, I stated firmly, trying to regain some semblance of control. Jamie, we're through. And you, Alina, get out of my apartment. I never want to see your face again. Jamie opened his mouth but seemed to think better of it. Without a word, he turned and left. The slamming door an exclamation point on our now shattered relationship. Alina just laughed derisively. Oh, Brenna, always trying to be the principled one. Without me, you'd be completely alone in this world. Deep down you know you need me more than I need you. I looked at her with a mix of heartbreak and disgust. This was my own flesh and blood, someone who was supposed to have my back. But her callous betrayal cut deeper than any wound. Grabbing my purse, I pushed past her towards the exit. I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight. Don't be there when I get back tomorrow to collect my things. Running away again? She taunted. Just like when we were kids. I tuned out her voice, her toxic words no longer able to draw a reaction. My life as I knew it lay in ruins, but I would rebuild from the ashes. Starting now, Alina was dead to me. The next day, I returned to an empty apartment, just as I had demanded. As I packed my belongings, Jamie's discarded shirts and Alina's makeup stained the space that was once my sanctuary. I knew in that moment nothing would be the same. But at least one truth had been unveiled. The person I should have been able to trust above all others was the blade that cut deepest. With my life in boxes, I left behind the ruins of my past. Where I was headed, I didn't know. But any path away from Alina's deceit and the memory of Jamie's ultimate betrayal was the right direction. Blood might be thicker than water, but for me, the blood between sisters had been irreparably poisoned. It was time to start over and rebuild myself from this broken state. It had been 3 months since I left behind the wreckage of my life in that city. The stabbing pain had subsided into a dull ache, but I couldn't shake the bitter taste of betrayal from my mouth. I had settled into a cozy studio apartment and secured a freelance graphic design gig to keep me afloat. At least work provided a temporary escape from dwelling on Alina's treachery and Jamie's unfaithfulness. Then one evening my phone rang with an eerily familiar number. Against my better judgment, I answered tentatively, "Hello? Brenna?" My traitorous sister's sickly sweet voice oozed through the line. "It's me, Alina. I've been trying to reach you." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want? I have nothing left to say to you." "Please, you have to hear me out," she pleaded, her tone dripping with feigned remorse. "Jamie was just a horrible mistake. I've realized how much I need my big sister in my life." I scoffed at her audacity. "You stabbed me in the back and stole my boyfriend, all because you were jealous of my life. Why should I believe a word you say?" There was a pause, and then a sniffle, like she was choking back tears. "You're right. I was spiteful and cruel. I was so envious of what you had achieved that I tried to take it for myself. I've hit rock bottom, Brenna. I have nowhere else to turn." The remorseful act was almost convincing, but then I remembered the smug satisfaction on her face as she revealed the sordid affair. "Save your crocodile tears," I snapped. "You chose to betray me, and now you have to live with the consequences. Don't contact me again." I went to hang up, but her panicked voice burst through. "Wait, I'm pregnant, and the baby is Jamie's." Those words landed like a sucker punch to the gut. I drew in a shaky breath, my mind spinning. "You're lying," I managed weakly. "This is just another one of your manipulative games." "I swear on Mom and Dad's graves," she said, deadly serious now. "I need your support, Brenna. You're all I have left in this world. Please." Part of me inwardly recoiled at the thought of offering any help to the person who decimated my life. But another part, the hapless sister deep within, wanted to believe there was still a shred of redeemable humanity in Alina. "If what you're saying is true," I said carefully, "then you're going to need somewhere to stay and some help getting on your feet for the baby's sake. Not for you. Never for you again." "Thank you," she gushed, the relief palpable in her voice. "I'll make the arrangements right away to come stay with you. You won't regret this, I promise." I doubted those words, but I'd take solace in being able to keep my unforgivable sister at a distance while ensuring her child didn't suffer for her sins. As I hung up, an uneasy knot twisted in my gut. Deep down, I feared that allowing Alina back into my world, even peripherally, was a recipe for future disaster. But I owed it to that innocent baby to try to rein in its conniving mother. If she burned me again, there would be no more second chances. The bridge would be burned for good this time. Only then would I be free from the heavy burden of the sister I once loved, but now loathed. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let Alina stay with me until she got back on her feet. 3 days later, there was a knocking at my door. I steeled myself and pulled it open to see Alina standing there, her bump clearly visible beneath a tight maternity dress. She brushed past me without a word, suitcases in tow. "I've converted the den into a little nursery area for you," I said stiffly. "The couch pulls out to a bed." Alina shrugged as she dropped her bags. "I guess this place will have to do for now." Her dismissive tone immediately put me on edge. Over the next few weeks, the tension was suffocating. Alina insisted on having friends over frequently to my tiny apartment, drinking wine and gossiping loudly while I tried to get work done. I felt like an intruder in my own home. One evening, I finally snapped as a raucous group spilled out of the den, clouds of smoke entering my bedroom. "Get these people out of my apartment now!" I barked at Alina, who was cradling her belly as she took a long drag from a cigarette. She feigned an innocent look. "We're just having a little fun, Brenna. You need to learn to lighten up." That smug, infuriating look on her face, it was too much. I had dealt with her endless insults and violations of my boundaries, all for the sake of that unborn child. But enough was enough. "Get out," I said, struggling to contain the rage boiling inside me. "I should have never let you back into my life." Alina sneered, stabbing her cigarette into an ashtray. "What? You'll throw a pregnant woman out on the streets? That's low, even for you." Her friends murmured in shock, already painting me as the villain in this encounter they had witnessed. "After everything you've done to me?" I fired back, tears welling in my eyes. "You have the audacity to take zero accountability and act like the victim here?" I turned away before letting my fury erupt and rushed out the door, needing to escape. I ended up holed up in a dingy 24-hour diner, sipping stale coffee, and wondering where my life went so horribly astray. I realized with sinking certainty that no matter how much I gave to appeasing Alina, she would never reciprocate. She was a remorseless black hole who only took and took until there was nothing left to give. I was tired of being the source that fed her insatiable need to manipulate. By the time I finally returned home near dawn, the apartment was blessedly silent, but it hardly felt like home any longer. In the end, Alina had gotten what she wanted. My sanctuary had been utterly defiled. I spent the next several days dodging Alina completely by burying myself in work and heading to the office to avoid her chaos. Then one day, I got a notification that I had been evicted from my apartment due to the constant partying and noise complaints. When I confronted Alina, she played dumb. You know how wild my friends can get sometimes. I tried to keep it under control, I swear. She had undermined me once again, this time destroying my living situation through neglect and irresponsibility. Alina had won, confident that I would never actually make her leave, as her due date grew closer. But the isolation and despair of losing my home validated what I already knew. I was better off alone than continuously being tormented by my own sister's venom. With nothing left to lose, it became startlingly clear what I had to do next. I would make Alina pay dearly for her multitude of sins against me. Once and for all, she needed to atone for the trail of misery she had unleashed. An idea began formulating in my mind, a deliciously devious plan to strip away that smug facade and make her feel the ultimate consequences. Revenge would be mine. After being evicted from my apartment, I had no choice but to crash with a friend while I got back on my feet. Alina had found a place to stay as well, though I made it clear I wanted zero contact with her unless it involved the baby. A few weeks later, I was interviewing for a graphic design role at a small agency. My previous work had them practically drooling to bring me aboard. As I waited in the lobby, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp suit entered and gave me a warm smile. "You must be Brenna. I'm Cole, one of the lawyers who works with the agency on contracts and whatnot." I shook his outstretched hand, immediately comforted by his confident yet gentle demeanor. There was a kindness and integrity to his eyes that I hadn't encountered in a long time. After nailing the interview, I was offered the job on the spot. As I excitedly relayed the news to Cole, he flashed that smile again. "In that case, you'll have to let me take you out for celebratory drinks tonight, my treat." I'll admit, I was taken aback by his forwardness. But after everything with Alina and that snake Jamie, it was also refreshing to be direct and let intentions be known instead of dealing with mind games. "You know what? I'd like that," I replied with a sly grin. We ended up in a dive bar trading stories from our checkered pasts, with Cole being surprisingly open about overcoming a gambling addiction in his 20s. For my part, I gave him the carefully redacted version of my tale, avoiding any mention of Alina's treachery. "Sounds like this ex of yours really put you through the ringer," he observed after I danced around the details. "I'm just glad I was able to get my life on track before anything too disastrous happened." Something about Cole's soothing presence and words of encouragement left me longing to finally unburden the full truth I had been carrying alone for months. So many times Alina had weaponized her fake tears and pleas for support, manipulating me into offering misplaced empathy. But gazing into Cole's earnest eyes, I sensed I could finally confront those demons head-on without fear of exploitation. He just seemed to exude trustworthiness from every pore. "There's more to the story," I admitted, taking a stealing breath. "One that's eaten me up inside for longer than I can stand." Cole leaned in attentively as I relayed the foul details. Alina's despicable seduction of Jamie, her callous reveal of their affair, the psychological torment she inflicted repeatedly under the guise of needing family. With each agonizing confession, I could feel the weight of shame and anger releasing from my body. To his immense credit, Cole didn't once interrupt or judge. He simply listened, letting me purge those toxic burdens into the space between us. When I finally reached the end, tears streamed freely down my cheeks. Cole reached his hand across the table and clasped mine firmly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all that," he said with quiet compassion. "Your sister, she sounds like a truly terrible person." I let out a shuddering breath, clinging to his steadying grip. "The worst part is, she keeps finding new ways to haunt me and make me miserable. I want to move on, but she won't let me." Cole's expression hardened as he gave a slow nod. "Then we need to make sure she can never hurt you again." Those 9 words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. For once, it wasn't just me against the cruel machinations of my own flesh and blood. I had an ally. As our eyes locked, I realized Cole was the asset I needed to finally, permanently put Alina in her place once and for all. No more toying with my life. No more toxic manipulations enabled by misguided family loyalty. It was time to stop being the victim and take control. Alina wanted to see the dark side. She was about to get her reign of terror paid back to her in spades. Over the next few weeks, Cole and I began hatching an intricate plan to bring Alina's misdeeds to light. I filled him in on all the sordid details and depraved acts she had committed, stoking the fires of his protective anger. "She needs to pay for what she's done," Cole stated firmly one evening over strategy meeting beers. "Exploiting family ties and decimating your life like that is unforgivable." I nodded fervently. Alina's twisted actions had cost me my home, my relationship, my peace of mind. All because of her jealousy and depravity. "I want to expose her lies and make her suffer the consequences," I declared, tempering the vengeful ire burning in my heart. "But I also want to do it in a way where she can never play the victim again." Cole leaned back, pensively stroking the stubble on his chiseled jaw as he processed my words. "You're talking about giving her enough figurative rope to hang herself," he said at last. "Getting her overconfident, poisonous fangs to extend so we can restrain them for good." A slow smile stretched across my face. "Leave it to the lawyer to articulate the strategy so perfectly." "Exactly. We need to make her slip up and reveal her true vile nature publicly, removing any plausible deniability." "And I know just the event that would make the perfect stage," Cole replied with a wolfish grin. A few days later, I was seated across from Alina at a luncheonette near her place. Her belly was massively swollen. The insufferable brat would be dropping that kid any day now. "You wanted to meet?" She regarded me with patent disinterest as she idly stirred her iced tea. "This better be good. Being on my feet is so taxing lately." I fought to keep my expression neutral as I produced a glossy invitation embossed with an award ceremony logo. "You remember that big design gala I attended last year? The one that effectively launched my career?" Alina's eyes narrowed as she caught the distinct whiff of professionalism and prestige. Her mouth began watering like a predator detecting vulnerability. "Of course," she replied coolly, adding a demeaning hair toss for good measure. "The only real success you've ever had in this industry." Hook, line and sinker. Well, this year they've asked me to not only attend the VIP reception, but present my latest branding concepts to the entire convention hall. I made sure to state the words slowly and clearly to amplify their impact. "I see," Alina responded, her veneer of indifference cracking slightly as envy glinted behind her eyes. "That's a rather prestigious honor. Which is why I'd love for my family to be there supporting me," I continued in a sugary sweet tone. "You and Jamie should both come as my special guests. It'll be a magical evening I want to share with the people I care about most." The blatant exclusion of Mom and Dad did not go unnoticed, based on the way Alina bristled. But her lust for the opulent gala overpowered any immediate objections. "I suppose Jamie and I could grace your little convention with our presence," she huffed airily. "After everything we've been through, the least you can do is dedicate your career highlight to making it up to us." I smiled inside at those words and her telling choice of the possessive pronoun, us. as if Jamie was still her depraved courtier, the infatuated ex who had turned his back on me for Alina's talons. "It's a date, then," I replied in sugary tones. "I'll have the +1 tickets waiting for you both under guest of honor." Alina was practically glowing, already envisioning herself lapping up accolades by merely being adjacent to my achievement. How deliciously, naively misguided she would prove to be. As I turned to leave, I allowed myself one parting remark that hinted at the reckoning to come. "This night will be one you never forget, sis." She had no idea just how prophetic and ominous those words would be. The design gala ceremony was destined to be Alina's denouement, the unraveling of her conniving character before the very audience she so desperately craved. Let the games begin. The night of the gala finally arrived. Cole and I had been meticulously planning and preparing every detail for weeks. As I put the finishing touches on my show-stopping design presentation, he arrived at my place looking dapper in a tailored tuxedo. "You about ready to go and destroy your sister?" he asked with an excited glint in his eye. I took a deep breath and nodded. "More than ready. It's time for Alina's deception to finally catch up with her." When we arrived at the lushly decorated venue, Alina and Jamie were waiting by the VIP entrance, resplendent in formal attire. Her belly seemed obscenely inflated under the sleek maternity gown she wore. "Don't you two look like manned Mrs. High Society?" I remarked with syrupy sweetness as they turned to face me. Jamie averted his gaze guiltily, but Alina simply rolled her eyes. "Can't slum it too much for your precious career night, I suppose." Now, let's not start things off on the wrong foot," Cole smoothly interjected, placing a calming hand on my arm. "We're all here to celebrate Brenna's incredible accomplishments." "Ever the voice of reason," Alina purred, giving Cole an approving once-over. "You simply must introduce me to all your eligible colleagues later." "Actually, Alina, Cole is my partner," I replied firmly, squeezing his hand to emphasize the point. "He'll be by my side all evening." The tiniest flicker of disappointment passed over her features before that trademark predatory grin resurfaced. "How progressive of you, sis. I always suspected you batted for the other team." Cole cleared his throat uncomfortably as the double meaning hung in the air. "Well, shall we make our way inside? I believe the presentations are due to start shortly." We made our way through the grandiose double doors and took our seats near the front of the elaborately decorated auditorium. The energy among the assembled crowd was electric, with chatter and clinking glasses. I could feel Alina beside me seething with anticipation. After an opening speech from the host committee, it was finally time for my design presentation. I rose from my seat amidst warm applause and made my way to the stage, lectern before me. The crowd immediately hushed in rapt attention. Taking a fortifying breath, I launched into my presentation slides, a highly stylized branding concept for a new luxury resort. Each intricate graphic and color palette earned murmurs of approval from the audience. "Thank you all for such a wonderful reception to my work," I said as the final slide displayed. "I'm truly humbled and inspired to be among such talented peers in this creative field." Alina shifted impatiently beside Cole, clearly waiting for the real show to begin. That self-satisfied look on her face filled me with determination. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to give proper credit where it is sorely due, I continued, my voice hardening, to the person whose reprehensible misdeeds and depravity actually sowed the seeds for this conceptual rebirth. You could have heard a pin drop in that silent hall as I paused for maximum dramatic effect. Jamie and Alina exchanged a bewildered look. "Ladies and gentlemen," I proclaimed clearly and calmly, "let me tell you about the heinous transgressions of my own wretched sister Alina." And with that, a torrent of revelations began spilling forth from my lips. The seduction of Jamie, the bitter jealousy towards me, the callous manipulation of family bonds. My presentation shifted to projecting shocking proof through photos, texts, audio recordings that Cole had diligently compiled. Audible gasps and murmurs of shock echoed from the stunned crowd. Alina's mouth hung open, her face draining of color as the sordid truth unraveled. You bitch!" she erupted once the final piece of damning evidence played, causing her voice to overtake the mic. "How dare you try to publicly shame and humiliate me?" I simply stood calmly, letting her unleash a torrent of outrage that only further condemned her depravity in the eyes of the horrified attendees. Jamie beside her looked like a cornered animal. With one icy glare of contempt, I knew I had accomplished my objective. Alina's viperous fangs were fully extended, and I had the antidote to permanently neuter her poisonous ways. As security rushed in to subdue her, Cole took the stage, his voice booming with authority. "Alina Merriweather, you are hereby being charged with defamation of character, financial fraud, emotional duress, and a menagerie of other offenses against your own flesh and blood." The rest was a blissful blur. In one fell swoop, I had ripped away the veil of deception Alina had hidden behind for far too long. This was her undoing, televised to the entire creative community. There would be no recovering from such a merciless public dismantling of her true nature. At long last, my tormentor had been disarmed and brought to justice. As they led her away in humiliated hysterics, I savored that gratifying realization. Revenge really was a dish best served utterly, shockingly cold. The aftermath of my public takedown of Alina at the gala was swift and severe. In the days that followed, a veritable firestorm erupted across social media and the creative industry. Influential designers, artists, and peers I had looked up to for years took to their platforms to excoriate Alina's abhorrent actions and deceitful behavior. The vitriol was scalding, emboldened by the undeniable proof I had showcased. Jamie, clearly expecting to slink away from the carnage unscathed, instead found himself just as vilified. People couldn't fathom how he could betray me in such a craven manner with my own flesh and blood. What separation was too low to stoop? As for Alina, well, let's just say her phone kept ringing with notifications of friends, colleagues, and employers alike distancing themselves at light speed. Her vain pursuit of social status and prestige spectacularly imploded in her face. I watched it all unfold like a solemn observer, sipping coffee in my apartment with Cole's reassuring presence beside me. He squeezed my hand as each fresh wave of backlash rippled outwards. "No one can refute the truth of what you exposed," he said quietly. "The whole world can see Alina for the toxic, soulless person she truly is." I released a deep, cathartic sigh, feeling lighter than I had in what felt like an eternity. All this time spent suffocating under her manipulative grip, and now she's the one reaping the total alienation she deserves. A slight smile played across Cole's lips. That's not all the reaping she has in store. A few days later, Alina appeared at my apartment, her disgraceful fall from grace punctuated by haggard eyes and disheveled hair. The slightest swell of her belly served as a malignant reminder of her cardinal sin against me. "Happy now?" She spat before I could utter a word. "You've completely devastated my life and career, all for some pathetic bid at revenge." I rose calmly from the couch, straightening my spine to face her. "I should have done this a hell of a lot sooner. You brought this on yourself with your repugnant actions and inability to feel any shred of remorse." Alina opened her mouth to retort, but Cole cut her off as he emerged from the hallway, briefcase in hand. "I wouldn't attempt to plead any sort of defense if I were you," he stated flatly. "Your endless litany of offenses is too extensive to dismiss." Alina's eyes widened in sudden apprehension as Cole snapped open the briefcase, shuffling through a stack of folders and documents inside. "What are you talking about?" she demanded in a wavering voice. "Oh, did Brenna conveniently leave out the minor matter of the criminal proceedings we've initiated?" Cole replied with a sardonic grin. "Because in addition to the severe professional and societal fallout, you're also being pursued legally for your misdeeds." With deft precision, Cole began reciting an exhaustive list of charges. Financial fraud, defamation of character, emotional distress, harassment. The sheer number was dizzying. For each transgression, he brandished documented evidence in the form of bank statements, email trails, even voice recordings of her vindictive ravings. Throughout the surgical dressing down, Alina's countenance progressively drained of its former arrogant bluster. By the time Cole reached the end, her lower lip trembled and eyes glistened with impotent rage. "You can't be serious? Over what? Some juvenile sisterly feuding?" Cole's expression hardened like steel. "Over you inflicting permanent psychological devastation through repeated, calculated abuses towards your own family. Quite serious charges, I'd say." Alina said nothing, her mouth working soundlessly as the gravity of her predicament crashed down upon her. In a twisted way, I almost pitied the sniveling state she now found herself reduced to. The mighty really had fallen. "Get out of my home," I said in a toneless murmur. "I never want to see your wretched face again after what you've put me through." With that parting shot, Alina seemed to dissolve into a pathetic puddle of self-loathing and humiliation. She skulked from my apartment without another word, having no fight or survival instinct left after her vile soul had been extracted so ruthlessly. I turned and embraced Cole, nestling into the crook of his strong shoulder as the door clicked shut behind Alina's exit. At long last, the demon had been fully, permanently exorcised. I could breathe freely again, without her cancerous presence polluting my existence. As a new dawn rose, I reveled in the first day of reclaiming my life wholly on my own terms. Revenge could never be sweeter than this long-coveted liberation. With Alina forcibly extricated from my life, the world suddenly seemed brighter, the air crisper. Like a cancer in remission, the toxic malignancy that was my sister had been cut out, allowing healing to finally take root. In the weeks that followed her shameful departure, the fallout from my exposé at the gala continued rippling outwards in destructive waves. Alina found herself persona non grata in every professional circle, her reputation irreparably sullied. She was terminated from her posh marketing job after a tidal wave of outraged emails and calls overwhelmed the company's HR department. Self-inflicted pariah status ensured she was blacklisted from any other opportunities in the future. The legal ramifications were even more severe. I watched with a satisfied smirk as Alina shuffled into the courthouse for her first hearing, wearing an oversized coat to conceal her swollen pregnancy frame. The once radiant beauty had withered into a haggard, downtrodden shadow. Cole delivered an impassioned prosecution statement, methodically presenting all the evidence of his emotional abuse, financial misdeeds, and malicious actions compiled against me over the years. Her public defender could only sit mutely as he was buried under the overwhelming mountain of proof. Due to the severity and extent of these calculated offenses perpetrated by the defendant, we are seeking maximum punitive damages be awarded to the victim, Miss Brenna Wilkins, Cole proclaimed, shooting me a subtle wink of encouragement. I wasn't primarily concerned with monetary restitution. No amount could undo the trauma and gaslighting Alina had inflicted upon me. But I reveled in her ashen, defeated expression as the judges sworn her guilty on every count, saddling her with fines, community service obligations, and potential jail time. The ultimate insult was she wouldn't even be able to fall back on her false public relations skills in the future to salvage any sort of career resurrection. I had ensured her toxic reputation would forever supersede any professional competence. As the sentencing concluded, and bailiffs escorted Alina from the room in handcuffs, she finally met my eyes. The hollow, vitriolic glare she shot my way spoke volumes about the molten core of hatred still burning within her shriveled husk. A final burst of venom for the traitorous sister who orchestrated her downfall. I simply watched stoically, unmoved and unaffected by her empty, impotent rage. She had nobody to blame but herself for the miserable pit into which she now festered. I found it profoundly symbolic justice that she would likely give birth to her child under the oppressive weight of incarceration. That night, Cole took me out for a celebratory dinner at an upscale restaurant, treating me to expensive wine and desserts. As we polished off the last morsels, I caught him giving me an adoring look across the table. "What?" I asked with a slight blush at his tender gaze. "I'm just thinking about how far you've come," he replied meaningfully. "From the broken, emotionally battered person you were when we first met, to this brilliant, confident phoenix reborn from the ashes of your past traumas. You're a true inspiration, Brenna." I felt a lump catch in my throat at his heartfelt words. Cole had stood resolution at my side through all the turmoil, his solidity and compassion giving me the strength to persevere. He quite literally helped me take back my life. Without overthinking it, I reached across the table and took his hand, giving it an affectionate squeeze. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," I said softly. "You saw me at my lowest and darkest points, and still chose to believe in me and put that monster in her place. I'll never be able to repay that debt." Cole's thumb traced soothing circles over my knuckles as he gazed warmly into my eyes. Just promise me one thing, that you'll leave the past in the past. Let the hurt and anger go, and only allow positive growth from this point forward. I felt a solitary tear of release trickle down my cheek as I gave a firm nod, absorbing the depth of his caring counsel. For far too long, Alina's toxic legacy had weighed me down and inhibited me from true self-actualization. It was finally time to shed that heavy, corroded chain forever. You have my word, I replied, returning Cole's tender smile. With him by my side, I knew there was nothing but bright possibilities ahead. A lifetime's worth of potential awaited me, unburdened by the poisonous shackles of my own flesh and blood. For the first time in forever, I could breathe freely and choose my own destiny. Karma had ultimately had its karmic reckoning, delivering me from the torturous thrall of evil that was my sister. Moving forward, I would embrace hope, optimism, and the inner fortitude to never let such a cancerous force diminish my spirit again. A new chapter was finally free to begin.